I now convene the June 13-14, 2019 meeting of the Commission on Teacher Credentialing. Will the recording secretary please call roll?
Kathleen Olivey. Here. Kirsten Barnes. Here. Catherine Williams-Brown.
Here.
C. Michael Cooney.
Here.
Marisol De La Torre Escobedo. Anna Marie Francois. Jose Gonzalez. Here. Makita Guino Shire. Johanna Harwick. Here. Alicia Hine. Terry Jackson. Here. Bonnie Clapp. Kevin Kwon. Jim Marks. Monica Martinez. Here. Castle Redmond. Here. Ade Rodriguez. Present. Gina Sloan.
Here.
Andrew Wall. Here. We have a quorum.
Thank you. Commissioner Wall, will you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Last time I did this. Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Well done, Commissioner Wall. All right. I would like to welcome Anna Marie Francois to the Commission as the new ex officio representative of the University of California. Anna Marie is the Executive Director of UCLA's Center X, where her leadership guides the work of social justice educator preparation, development, and support for urban school communities. Dr. Francois has 30-plus years of teaching, teacher leadership, administrative experience in the Los Angeles Unified School District, the charter school community, and UCLA's Department of Education. Dr. Francois is a pioneer in leading education innovation. Having served as a founding member of the Vaughan Next Century Learning Center, the first grassroots charter school in California, establishing Impact, an innovative community-based urban teacher residency program, and launching the California chapter of the National Association for Multicultural Education. She is also co-visioning the UCLA and Man UCLA community schools, university-supported public schools in high-needs communities in Los Angeles. And they're quite spectacular schools. I've heard much about them. Her areas of interest and expertise are teacher development, community schooling, multicultural literacy, equity-guided instruction, and school-university collaboration. She holds a bachelor's degree in history, a master's degree in administration, supervision in higher education, and a doctorate in educational leadership. Welcome, Commissioner Francois, and would you like a moment to say anything?
One of the first things you have to know how to do is turn on the mic. Good morning. Thank you, Chair Sloan. I am so excited to be representing the UCs in this important work. You know that the University of California system is committed to collaborating with like-minded partners to ensure that all of our students across this state have access to and in front of them high-quality educators, particularly students who have historically not had high-quality educators with the commitment, capacity, and resilience to do this work over the long haul. And so as a UC representative, I hope that we can engage together to make sure that that happens. And as a longtime educator as well as servant, did I just say the word servant? To the commission, I've participated in quite a few commission activities over the years. I know that this work is really important, and I know that it's very complex, and it takes everyone around this table and our community, labor, CSU, private partners to make it happen. So thank you for welcoming me, and I look forward to the work together.
Thank you. Okay, item 1A is the approval of the April 2019 minutes. We'll need to make 3 separate motions to approve the ad hoc committee, executive committee, and regular session minutes. I'd like to remind everyone that only those who served on each committee can make and second the motion to approve the committee minutes. Do I have a motion from a member of the ad hoc committee to approve the April 2019 ad hoc committee minutes? So moved by Commissioner Rodriguez. Do I have a second? Seconded by Commissioner Kung. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. All right. Next, do I have a motion from a member of the Executive Committee to approve the April 2019 Executive Committee minutes?
So moved.
I have a motion by Commissioner Cooney. Do I have a second? Second by Commissioner Rodriguez. All right. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries. Last, do I have a motion to approve the April 2019 Commission minutes?
So moved.
Okay. Okay. I have a motion by Commissioner Rodriguez, seconded by Commissioner Olive. Discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed? Any abstentions? For Friday. Commissioner Kong's abstention for Friday. Okay, motion carries. Next item is item 1B, approval of the June 2019 agenda. We have an agenda insert for item 1C, a revised agenda item 2D. We will also have item 5A, update on the governor's proposed 2019-20 budget presented today instead of tomorrow. Do I have a motion to approve the June 2019 agenda? Okay. Motion approved by Commissioner Rodriguez. Do I have a second? Seconded by Commissioner Martinez. All those in favor say aye. All opposed? Motion carries. Agenda item 1C is approval of the June 2019 consent calendar. Do commissioners have any items they would like to consider in closed session? Commissioner Klatt?
I would like to pull item number 25, Ingersoll, and item 27, Ledesma, for closed session.
Okay. Thank you. Commissioner Rodriguez?
Yes, I'd like to pull Todd Benjamin Potter and Manuel Hermosillo Paul.
Numbers?
I don't have the numbers, but Manuel Hermosillo Paul. And I did let staff know that I'd be pulling these.
Okay. All right. And Commissioner Gonzalez?
Yes, I'd like to pull item 49, Avila.
All right. And Commissioner Gonzalez? I'm sorry, Hartwig, sorry. There.
I'd like to pull number 17, Foley.
Mm-hmm. Commissioner Kung?
I'd like to pull number 35, last name Norland.
Commissioner Barnes?
I didn't put the number down, but Anita Baskin. Number 5, Anne Marie Blevins. Sorry, I have a few. Number 18, Kenneth Gallegos. Number 23, Margarito Huerta. And number 25, Kenneth Ingersoll.
Yeah, we got that one, yep. Any others? All right. Do I have a motion to approve all remaining items on the consent calendar? So moved by Commissioner Olive. Do I have a second? Seconded by, who did I hear? Commissioner Jackson. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries.
Chair Sloan, may I request that somebody repeat back all the ones that were called?
Yes. Can somebody repeat back all of the consent items that were called?
I will attempt to do so. So number 25, Ingersoll, number 27, Ledesma, Todd Potter, Manuel, I didn't catch the second Hermosillo Paul, number 49, Aguilar, number 17, Foley, number 35, Norland, Anita Baskin, number 5, Blevins, number 18, Gallegos, number 23, Margarita, I didn't catch the last name, and then a second call for number 25.
Thank you.
So.
Are we good? Okay. Moving now to the chair's report, simply like to say happy summer. It is a time when we used to think that teachers got a break. We know now that teachers are working often all through summer, not only to improve their own work in the classroom, but to help students get to where they need to be in the fall when they enter into the next school year. But it's also a time of celebration. We have a soon-to-be graduate in our midst. Our student liaison, Aya Shep, is graduating on Monday. Congratulations. And some of us are still finishing off the quarter. I spent a good part of my weekend organizing my kitchen drawers, avoiding grading. That was good. All right. Anyway, those of us, I hope we all get a bit of a break. I know that at the Commission there is lots of work going on in the summer, but I hope Commission staff also get a bit of a break too. We will be back at it at the end of July. And happy summer. I'm going to turn it over now to our Executive Director, Sandy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Commissioners. It's wonderful to be here at the end of. We treat the new year as the beginning of the fiscal year, which is coming up, and we're expecting the budget to be signed soon, and that all of that triggers kind of a New Year's attitude around all of us. So we're coming to the end of this year, and that's exciting. Things have been busy here at the Commission. The number of us were able to attend the National Association of State Directors of Teacher Education and Certification, NASDEC. It's a deep in our industry community from all 50 states and other countries as well. The meeting was in Denver, and a number of us went. The keynote speaker was Harry Caton from Britain, whose topic was reasonable regulation. So that gives you a sense of kind of who was drawn to this session. It was a very insightful session. And the long and the short of it is we should regulate as simply and as close to the problem as we possibly can and work on solutions that actually address problems that we're trying to solve. So, and that might sound like it's the science of the obvious, but it was really actually very, very, very good for all of us. There were strands on accreditation, which Terry Clark and Aaron Sullivan attended to throughout the conference. There were sessions on reciprocity, and we had Aaron Skubal was in a packed room with different states talking about reciprocity, and it's a problem. It's a perennial problem, a chronic issue of how do we begin to recognize teaching expertise and other credentialing expertise across state lines when states each hold very particular priorities. So I'm not sure we've hit on a solution strategy yet, but we continue to admire the problem together, and that's useful to all of us as we try to find a solution to it. We also had the opportunity to present on our performance assessment work. Amy Rising and Heather Klesch from Evaluation Systems did a presentation on that work. The performance assessment work is of increasing interest, I think, to other states. The ways in which we're using performance assessments and other indicators in our new, what we are framing and calling a performance-based accreditation system, that is gaining some traction and some interest with other states as well. So it was a very generative and good set of conversations. I actually had the pleasure of hosting a conversation that was didn't have a structured agenda. It was anybody that would like to talk about subject matter testing for teacher licensure, come on down. And we filled the room. There were 15 or so states that attended that session, and the Ontario College of Teachers was also there. And the questions that we're grappling with here as we think about the role of testing in our licensing system they're popping up across the country. And it's a good time for all of us to be thinking about the foundational question of what does it mean to be prepared adequately in your content area to teach, and how is our system set up to really actualize that and get our teachers into the field that as we need them to be. So very, very good meeting at NASDEC. Had the opportunity also, following up on that, with Commissioner Francoise from UCLA to participate in the inaugural meeting of the Ed Prep Laboratory, which is a new initiative that the Learning Policy Institute is getting off the ground. And its focus is to really bring together 10 states, about 15 different leading edge institutions, to talk about what are the ways in which we are really pursuing deeper learning and preparing teachers and leaders together to move teachers into practice that is really promoting and developing deeper learning opportunities for students. So it was a fascinating meeting. We have 4 institutions of the 15 institutions. 4 of them are located in California. High Tech High School is part of it. The San Francisco Teacher Residency, UC Berkeley, and UCLA are all participating institutions. And this was a very powerful set of conversations for 2 days with a number of policy agency representatives, and I had the pleasure of being a standards board representative in that conversation, and I'm looking forward to how that lab helps us focus on the high end of and the leading edge of our practice in teacher and leader education. So that's exciting work as well. So finally, we are sad to say goodbye to our student preparation student liaison, but also congratulate you on your successful graduation and moving into practice. And we hope to be hearing from you about how that practice is going. And we're kind of your cheerleading support team from this table. But that means that nominations for our student liaison position are open, and we are seeking those and hope to have somebody in place by the fall. So that concludes my report.
Thank you, Executive Director Sandy. Do commissioners have any items to report? Commissioner Barnes?
Yes, I'll be very interested when the budget is passed, because there's a lot of bills and things out there regarding mental health in schools, which is very needed, as we all know. But a couple of them that are kind of exciting that I hope go through is, and this is through, we just had our CASC board meeting this last weekend, that Prop 60, that there's $10 million for Mental Health Student Service Act to provide competitive grants and partnerships between county mental or behavioral health departments. We're not sure where the allocation for that is going yet, as well as AB 1322, which would create an Office of School-Based Health, and AB 1312, which creates a registry for private college consultants. And so this is important because, as we know, and I keep saying, the mental health of our students, also pushing for trauma-informed services at our sites, as well as I'm fortunate I'm on the health and safety work group for the transition team through the California for CDE. And so we're coming up with a couple of short-term and long-term goals to help address the teacher shortage in the area of health. And a couple of the big things that have come up are mental health services for all staff and students, as well as trauma-informed education, as well as several other things. So it's a big push. It's much needed. I'm glad that, as I said, the school counselors are going to be getting this. I believe it's in the teacher and the administrator, but sadly it's needed, but it's very important. So I'm glad that it's a real focus, and I'll be interested to see where this heads, as well as how that affects things here at the commission and future updatings in standards and credentialing.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Barnes. Commissioner Greno-Shire.
Good morning. I wanted to just alert commissioners that I'm going to be forwarding an email invitation to all of you, and I didn't want it to go into your spam. And it's in relationship to the UC-CSU Environmental and Climate Change Literacy Project and Summit. The summit is on Thursday, December 12th, and then the following day on the 13th. And it is a collaboration between UC and CSU to inform the next generation of environmental champions in K-12. And so I just wanted to alert you that I would be forwarding an email. It'll come from UC/CSU. So I hope you'll be able to attend. Thank you.
Thank you. Other commissioner reports? Do any liaisons have items to report? Commissioner Brown?
I've forgotten how to turn on the mic. Uh-oh, Anna Marie, I'm going to need a lesson from you. I have a couple of things to say. First of all, it's really great to be back. I'm sorry I missed last meeting with being at the Academic Senate State Plenary Session. But I wanted to make just 3 quick points. One is that the community colleges as a whole are really looking overall at a college redesign initiative that is focusing on student success and really looking more at the whole student. And in particular, many of our districts are looking very closely at something that you may hear of called the College Promise Program that is really trying to support students in being able to start at community college full time, which is a real challenge for many of our students financially. But in doing that, one of the things that we're looking at in particular is what we're calling in our district transformative teaching and learning, but particularly focused with equity-informed instruction. So I was really glad to hear that, as we're working on that quite diligently, and I think it's really going to make a difference for those people who want to become teachers and are starting at the community college level. The second thing I wanted to mention is the Learning Policy Institute is sponsoring a study that's actually focused not only on California, but is in California intense, looking at institutions, both at the community colleges and 4 years, about innovative teacher preparation initiatives, and our college is going to be part of that process. And third, there's a Heising-Simons UCLA-based 3-year grant in early math teacher preparation that is looking at both 4-year and 2-year institutions in California. The 3-year grant will focus on the central part of the state, and then NorCal, and then SoCal. And our college is also part of that process. So I'll be making updates as time goes on. I think all of them are really, really important initiatives that have serious implications for teacher prep. So fingers crossed. Yeah.
Thank you, Commissioner Brown. Any other liaison reports? Commissioner Rodriguez?
Good morning. I'll keep my report short. The Committee on Accreditation met in May 2nd and May 3rd. Incredibly robust agenda of, I want to say, 33 items and 31 action items. So initial approval, discussions on revisits, right, as different people are on the different color scheme of accreditation and the let's see, giving their reports. It was, the committee continues robust conversations, asking great questions, very incisive questions. And unfortunately, Friday morning, because it was Thursday and Friday, I got food poisoning. And so I was out for a couple of hours Friday morning, but, everything continued. It's not like the world stopped. And they continued to accredit and revise and revisit. So it was a wonderful, as I said, very robust meeting.
Thank you. Any other liaison reports? Okay. I now recess the general session, and as mentioned, we move to the Fiscal Policy and Planning Committee. Commissioner Martinez, will you please convene the committee?
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for accommodating this for today. I now convene the June 2019 meeting of the Fiscal Policy and Planning Committee. The committee has one information item before it today. Item 5A is the update on the governor's proposed 2019-20 budget. Michelle Peral will present this item. Ms. Peral, will you please begin?
Good morning. Okay. Let's talk budget first thing in the morning, right? Always fun.
Shaking it up.
So I'm here to provide an update on the 2019-20 state budget and its impact on the commission. The governor did, as we all know, release his initial budget in January, and he followed it up with his May revision, which was released last month. So as it relates to the commission specifically, our internal budget was largely unchanged from the January proposal. Just a reminder, the January proposal did include for us some one-time money of $1.235 million to create a teaching performance assessment for special education. It also included within that an additional staff person. Those of you that have been around the table know we've been working on the teaching performance assessments for a while without really any augmentation. So having an additional staff member dedicated to that will be helpful. However, the May revision did provide a slight change for us in our staffing. We have been working for several years closely with the Attorney General's office on some of our disciplinary cases, and as such we have been providing them for almost the last 5 to 6 years some help within their investigation needs to meet the needs they need with their casework. So recognizing that this is going to be an ongoing workload, the governor did provide an additional staffing augmentation to convert. We have 3 temporary positions that currently we use in that role here at the commission, and they will be moved into a permanent position. So it was an increase of 3 additional permanent positions within the commission. So that actually provided for us overall between January and May 4 additional new positions here in the commission across those 2 areas. So following, just so you have a sense of where we are, the legislature has been working through the weekend and then now into this week on coming up with a budget a budget plan. We have met and have been in front of the budget conference committees over the last several months, just vetting through what our specific budget is. We anticipate, I was told, I believe I read this weekend that at least the legislature has come up with a framework of a deal, and they will work between now and tomorrow on voting on that budget. As we all know, if they don't pass the budget by June 15th, they don't get a paycheck. It's interesting, since that's been in place, they've never not missed that deadline. So they have until Saturday at midnight, technically, to pass the budget, and then after that, the governor will be presented with that budget, and he has technically until June 30th to sign it. However, it has been indicated that he plans to sign it quickly. He'd like to actually get the budget done a little bit in advance. So that's pretty much the overview for our budget. Any questions you might have, I'm happy to answer them.
We will now open for public comment. All right. Without any cards, the public comment period for this item is now closed. Do commissioners have any questions on this item? Commissioner Brown?
I have some questions, but I don't know that they're really answerable. This is kind of my first sort of push into looking at fiscal things. It looks to me in our budget that nearly 20% of our budget is now focused on issues around, I guess what I would call the support that you were talking about, Michelle, in terms of working with special investigators and the attorney. Is that an ordinary? In terms of the history of CTC, that what we're doing is that about the budget proportion that we usually put to things like all that we're doing in closed session for sort of discipline issues?
So Just so you do have a sense the way our budget is broken down. So since the audit occurred back in 2011 and there was restructuring that was done both with our the income that we have coming from into our teacher credentialing fund, the legislature put a set aside to the Office of the Attorney General, and it is set aside every year. That set aside amount is just over $5.5 million. Mm-hmm. The positions I just spoke to you about in our investigative unit do actually come out of that line item. And so that money has, for the last 6 or 7 years now, I guess it hasn't been about 5 years since our fee went up, has been set aside for work specifically within the discipline area. But it is really a allotted line item to the Attorney General's office. Does that sort of answer your question?
That begins to give me a sense of, where it comes from and what the priorities are from the legislature in terms of identifying issues and then providing support.
And that, and that number, just so you know, that has been the standing number since they implemented the line item. It hasn't changed. And so what does happen is from year to year, depending on the billing, it rolls over and changes slightly, but that is the standard line item amount.
So, Madam Chair, if I just might add to that, I appreciate the explication. We are planning, I've asked Michelle to prepare for us a more detailed kind of overview of the budget, the salaries and benefits, operations by divisions, et cetera. We won't get down to line item. This much is spent on this project, et cetera, but we will give you the broad categories of the distribution of the budget once the budget is signed and we actually know what the final numbers look like. So that'll either be August or September meeting where you'll get a better sense of the whole picture.
Right, because my follow-up question was going to be kind of looking at the preparation and licensing of teachers. And one of the things that I noticed was, as we're looking at the budget, I looked at the 3-year budget, and it looked like, though I don't know what positions mean, it looked like there had been a 3-year decrease proportionately in the financing of the preparation and licensing of teachers. And I thought, gee, isn't that the main function of the commission? Not that I'm not talking to legislators, but in here thinking again, what are our purposes, what are our priorities, and what are the supports that allow us to do the work that we need to do. So I was just looking at that.
Yeah, and I can comment. I know when you look at what we call the galley, the budget galley, which is when you click on that link, that's what you get. It can be a little bit confusing, and that's why what Mary just indicated, I think, will be helpful moving forward, both, not just for staff, but for you as commissioners, and understanding at least broadly how funds get distributed. Because oftentimes when you look at what is provided at the state level, why you're seeing some of those increases and decreases is mostly in relation to the one-time money that they give us. So year over year, you may see, a bump, and if it's not out of general fund, so the grants that they give us are typically out of general fund, not our own funding source. But we have had, over the last 3 or 4 years, several one-time uses. And so what you'll see is that, and then it'll drop off the next year. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit, it doesn't give a real clear picture sometimes about what our actual revenue are. Our actual year-over-year revenue outside of one-time allocations has actually stayed pretty steady for the last 5 years. So.
I have a follow-up question. I think I left my laptop back there, but I think I saw there were going to be 4 new positions that were approved. Is that below or above or what you requested?
That is below what we requested. Okay. We did request some additional positions in certification. As we have talked about, are seeing, because there has been an infusion of money into the education, arena, getting people into teaching credentials. We are seeing an uptick. And so we've asked for some additional support. We were not funded for those. We did ask for some additional support also within our disciplinary division. They did convert the temporary positions, but we had asked for some additional positions on top of that just for workload purposes, which we did not receive. So, but we did receive the one within for the assessment position. So it's a net permanent increase of 4, but really it's it's really for us body wise is an increase of 1 because we're converting 3.
Okay. Great. Thank you for that clarification. Any other questions? Yes.
Follow up
Gonzalez.
along those lines. So with the 147.6 that have been approved, looking at our current workload and in the out years, what would the ideal number or estimated number be? Because there's a
Like
lot
500.
of work on the horizon for us.
I don't mean to laugh, but if you asked any of my division heads, they would tell you they would love to double their staff. But if you looked at what we asked for this year, which we felt was a very conservative ask, and this was, in our opinion, just to maintain current workload. It wasn't to take on additional workload. We really could have used about another 5 staff within our discipline area, and then, like I said, we asked for 2 in our certification area. Again, that was probably, conservative in our hopes of getting additional folks, but that's kind of where we're at as it relates to just maintaining.
Commissioners, any other questions on this item? Okay. If not, this is an information item. No action is needed. Thank you, Ms. Peralt. Yeah. This concludes the business before the Fiscal Policy and Planning Committee. The committee is adjourned.
Thank you, Commissioner Martinez. Next is the Educator Preparation Committee. Commissioner Rodriguez, will you please convene the committee?
Okay. Good morning, commissioners and public and staff. I'd like to call the June 2019 meeting of the Educator Preparation Committee to order. We have 6 agenda items. All 6 items are scheduled for today. The first item, 2A, is proposal to update transition timeline of education specialist programs to new standards and development of an education specialist teaching performing assessment. This item is being presented by William Hattrick and Sarah Solari Colombini. This is an information action item. Ms. Colombini, will you please begin?
Good morning, Commissioners. William and I have decided to divide these items differently this morning, so I will just take the first item since they're smaller items, and William will take the second item. So you'll only hear from one of us on each item, but we're both happy to chime in on each other's items. So, as always. So, good morning again. So, agenda item 2A presents the proposal to update the transition timeline for preliminary education specialist preparation programs as they move to the new standards and plan for developing a teaching performance assessment for those programs to use with their candidates. In August of 2018, the Commission adopted the revised standards for education specialist programs and indicated that all programs would need to transition to the new standards by the fall of 2020. However, the special education work is quite complex, and although the standards were adopted, 2 other critical pieces to the revision of the credential system for special educators still needed to be addressed at that time, which were the authorization statements and the development of a teaching performance assessment. So at the April 2019 meeting, just a couple months ago, the Commission adopted proposed authorization statements for the new education specialist credentials. So the regulatory process for the credentials is now underway. And as we approach the final stages of the revision to the education specialist credential, we have funding and staffing, as you just heard, included in the governor's budget to support this work over the next 3 years. So this timing should allow the Commission to work closely with programs as they redesign their coursework to meet the program standards that have been revised, and the development of the TPA as it's being developed. So for some additional context, there are 133 initial education specialist programs, those that prepare our candidates, offered at 66 different institutions. And this is shown on page 1 of your agenda item. If you remember, there are 5 different special education credential areas within our new credential structure. There's the mild to moderate support needs, the extensive support needs, early childhood special education, visual impairments, and deaf and hard of hearing. This means that many institutions will be transitioning multiple programs and will be collaborating closely with their general education peers to incorporate the universal TPEs. The timing of this transition to coincide with the development of the Education Specialist TPA will allow programs, to integrate that new TPA as they transition to the new program standards. A timeline illustrating the work of the Commission staff over the next 3 years has been included on page 2 of your agenda item. This timeline also honors the time needed for faculty to submit course changes and syllabi and have those changes approved in order to fully transition to the new standards. Ultimately, the proposed timeline denotes fall of 2022 as the transition date for all preliminary education specialist programs, which means that candidates enrolling for the 2022-23 academic year would meet the updated TPEs and take a TPA. So staff recommends that the Commission adopt the fall 2022 as the transition date for all preliminary education specialist teacher preparation programs. And if the Commission takes action to adopt the proposed transition timeline, staff will work with program sponsors to share this information. So that concludes.
Thank you. We will now open up for public comment, and I do have one public comment card. Patricia Pernin and Jacob Guthrie. If you could please come up. If you could state your name and affiliation for the record.
Coordinator over credentialing and added authorizations for LA Unified.
And I'm Jacob Guthrie, Assistant Director of Recruitment and Selection for Los Angeles Unified.
Good morning, Commissioners, and congratulations, Anna Marie Francois. I'm so happy for you. It is so well deserved. I'm so happy. First, my staff and I would like to thank the Commission on the wonderful work they have done in developing the new Education Specialist TPEs, including so many people from the field and further clarifying the specialty areas for Education Specialist Credential. Most of the people that we work with in LA Unified for our credentialing program are special education teachers, and we are so happy to see this all moving forward. And I want to thank the Commissioners, too, for the way in which this was all done, and the staff as well, because we had some of our own staff on these committee meetings, as well as a teacher from the field on these meetings. So again, I thank you all for all the wonderful work that was done. We would also like to thank the Commission for extending the timeline for full implementation of the new standards and TPEs to ensure that all programs are provided sufficient time to collaborate with the faculty and all stakeholders to fully implement the new education specialist structure in conjunction with the anticipated TPA. Again, a very exciting period of time with the TPA. We also feel that through this new structure, we will be able to better meet the needs of the children in our schools and to intentionally move toward a whole child approach in education. So thank you again, Commissioners, and thank you, staff.
And we would also like to thank the Commission staff for their hard work on the development of the proposed timeline and to adopt the new program standards. And we just wanted to talk about some things that came up in our review of the background of the agenda item. We wanted to highlight the number of options that teachers currently have if they would like to pursue an education specialist credential in the area of deaf and hard of hearing or visual impairment. Currently, there are 6 DHH programs statewide and 2 programs for the teachers of the visually impaired. Since the 2014-15 school year, the Los Angeles Unified School District has hired 69 deaf and hard of hearing teachers and 16 teachers of the visually impaired. During the 2018-19 school year, Los Angeles Unified hired 9 DHH teachers and 5 teachers of the visually impaired, which is on par with our average hires over the last 5 years. The small number of programs from which to recruit qualified teachers makes it extremely difficult for our district and others to meet the needs of our students who are either deaf and hard of hearing or visually impaired. We would encourage the Commission to work with California IHEs to explore expanding DHH and VI teacher preparation options to help meet this need. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. Commissioners, this is an information action item. Do I have a motion? And then we can start a discussion once there's a motion. Do I have a motion that the Commission adopt the proposed transition plan?
So moved.
Okay. Is there a second? Okay. So moved by Commissioner Olive and seconded by Commissioner Barnes. Any discussion on this item? Commissioner Greenough-Shire? And then
I would like to again thank Sarah and William for all of their work on these revisions to the special ed credential, and to also thank the Commission for this extended deadline. As one of my colleagues from Cal State Long Beach wrote in a letter, this time will allow faculty to work across disciplines to develop really strong collaborative teacher preparation programs. And so I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. So thank you.
Commissioner Sloan?
I too think this is a good idea. In order to, I think what we really want to be seeing is that we have general education and special education faculty truly integrating the work in a way that's very different from how it's currently being done. And this needs attention and time to figure things out without there being some high stakes immediately. We know that when we have an opportunity to dig deeply and learn from what we're doing, we do the work better. I do have a question, though. With this extended timeline, are we requiring a transition plan?
So we are working on a transition plan, and actually, yeah, so we do have a transition plan under development, and with the work of strengthening and streamlining that the Commission has been has undertaken in the past several years, we are trying to adopt pieces of the program review process to utilize for the transition plan. Mm-hmm. So your transition plan for the education specialist programs will look really similar to what programs are doing for program review, so that we're not reinventing the wheel here, that we're going to take pieces of program review, not all of it. Program review right now has 7 required elements and I think 18 specific exhibits. This will be more like 4 of the elements and maybe 5 or 6 exhibits that the programs will submit as their transition plan. And all of that, of course, would then be part of their program review that they would submit under the accreditation cycle. So yes, there will be a transition plan. A PSA will be coming out soon now that the Commission has taken action. Mm-hmm. And of course, we have plans to provide technical assistance to those programs as well. So.
Great. I think that's important also that it's not additional work that it gets folded into what programs have to report. At the same time, I think that we want to be sure that programs are actually paying attention to the kinds of things they need to pay attention to as they transition over. As Commissioner Greenough-Shire mentioned, Long Beach Unified, they have a long history of integrating special ed and general ed, and they knew and wrote to us to say we need more time. Sometimes I worry a little bit that we don't know what we don't know. So other programs, they don't really know what it's going to take to do this work with the integrity that we want. If the transition plan can in any way sort of help people know what to pay attention to as they're planning, and I know all of you, I know you two have talked to many programs across the state who are doing this work well. I think that could be helpful too. And then ultimately, what would be wonderful is an opportunity for programs to share their work and learn from one another in some sort of a conference setting. I don't know how that can happen, but it is something that we should all think about.
So some of the ideas that staff has had here is maybe that regional technical assistance where they could come together, programs could come together and do some sharing about what's occurred and their good thoughts. So hopefully maybe is that kind of in line with what you were thinking?
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Yes, Commissioner Wall?
So I just want to echo the sentiment of the appreciation. Before each commission meeting, the private not-for-profit sector holds a call. And I hear the concerns of the private institutions. And so to hear you talk about technical assistance and the transition plan, in fact, institutions were asking about a transition plan. I think they utilize that as a tool to mobilize, so I think it's important to hear that. But they're very appreciative of the time, and I echo the sentiment about working really collaboratively together, general education and special education. The time is really valuable. Thank you.
Commissioners? Yes, Commissioner Francois.
Thank you, and thanks for your hard work on this. I think this is really important, particularly the transition plan. I have a question about the timeline for the operational ed specialist Cal TPA, and I'm wondering how the proposed timeline compares to the multiple subject, single subject rollout. There's a lot of time for transition and implementation, and I'm hoping that there's enough time to thoughtfully think about the design and development of the ed specialist Cal TPA.
So Amy's going to come to the table because this is her bailiwick.
Good morning. So your question is how this is similar to the timeline we just moved through, and should it be? So very grateful for the extra year. Otherwise, we'd be starting 1920, 2021. So we're sort of on this 2-year timeline for development because we want to have a pilot test, and then we want to iterate, and then we want to have a field test, and then we want to iterate, and then we want to begin administration. So it would be right now in our planning a similar timeline, just pushed 1 year out. So 2021, 21, 22, beginning in 22, 23. So a similar process. We've learned a great deal about how to support programs through this kind of transition, and the fact that we can, particularly in our APA work, where they kind of redeveloped their programs, and then we came up with the APA for administration, and then there had to be some reworking. We're trying to avoid that here. So I think in the combined effort between program, standard, development, and design and coursework and support and clinical practice alongside the development of the TPA for special ed this time should be a better, I think, more efficient plan. So it's kind of a 2 answers. It's similar in that we're looking at a 2-year to 3-year development process, starting with planning in this first year and then moving into real development. But we hope to be doing it slightly differently in that we're doing it alongside programs as they think about this combination of bringing gen ed and special ed together. Yeah.
You're welcome. Yes, Commissioner Greneau-Shire.
I just wanted to follow up on Chair Sloan's idea about some convenings or summits or meetings to share these best practices, and would offer that the California Alliance for Inclusive Schooling, which is meeting at every CCTE meeting now, might be a good organizational body to help facilitate that work. For some of the new members around the table, the Alliance is an intersegmental group of professionals who are dedicated to developing inclusive teacher preparation programs to ensure that graduates are ready for the environment of multi-tiered systems of support in schools where they're going to land, hopefully. So that might be a great opportunity. Mary, Executive Director Sandy sits on the Alliance, as do I and some other folks with the Department of Education, and privates are represented by Don Cardinal at Chapman University. So I would definitely think that would be a vehicle, and I know we would be happy to consider that.
I think that's a great idea. Thank you.
Commissioners, any other comments? Okay, so we do have a motion and a second, and we'll call for a vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Anyone opposed? Abstentions? Thank you. Motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Hattrick and Ms. Solari. Colombini. We're here for the next item. All right. All right, next we have item 2B. Program standards for early childhood special education, added authorization programs. This item is being presented by William Hattrick and Sarah Solari Colombini. This is an information action item. Mr. Hattrick, will you please begin?
Sure. Good morning, Commissioners. Agenda item 2B presents updated program standards for the early childhood special education added authorization. As a reminder, this authorization is available to education specialists who would like to be able to work with students ages birth through kindergarten in disability areas that are not currently covered by their base credential. Updates to the 4 standards, as highlighted on page 2, are needed to align with the new preliminary early childhood special education credential standards and teaching performance expectations that were adopted last year. PSD staff drafted the changes to the existing standards and shared those with the ECSE expert group, and that's listed on their names and affiliations are listed in Appendix A for you. Upon receiving their feedback, additional changes were made. The proposed changes included added language to broaden the knowledge, skills, and abilities required for teaching children from birth through kindergarten, and also expanded to include orthopedic impairment. Staff recommends that the Commission adopt the updated program standards, which would allow approved ECSE added authorization programs to transition to these new standards on the same timeline as the other education specialist credentials.
Always taking advantage of what I can do. I am really excited about this. I think this is speaking from not just the special ed side of it, but the early childhood side of it. This is a long time coming, and those of my colleagues that work in ECSE are very excited about being not only part of the special ed world, but being able to advocate on the part of this idea of moving together with general ed, which early childhood special ed has done for years. So this is perfect timing, and may I just endorse that the pieces that have been spoken about in terms of this extra year and the transition plan and collaboration, that early childhood special ed and the early childhood world in general come into the California Alliance. I think that's a great next step for the youngest children of our state. So, hooray.
Commissioners, any other comments? Yes, Commissioner Francois.
I'm so excited about this, and I just want to say that it warms my heart as well as moves me that you have made these edits that lift up the assets that young people, even as early childhood, bring into their learning experience. And the fact that you're articulating that and surfacing it moves our profession forward in ways that I would not have imagined even 5 years ago. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Okay, so we do have a motion on the floor. I'll call for vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Anyone opposed? Abstentions? Great, motion carries. Thank you so much, Mr. Hattrick and Ms. Solari Columbini. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll continue with item 2C. All right, so see you back here at 10:11. Agenda item. Wait time there. All right. Our next agenda item is item 2C, clarification of the expectations for concurrent bilingual authorization candidates related to the teaching performance assessment requirement. This item is being presented by Miranda Gutierrez. She is joined at the table by Ivania Soto, representing California Association for Bilingual Education, CABE, and Lynn Scott, representing California Association for Bilingual Teacher Education, CABTE. This is an action item. Ms. Gutierrez, will you begin?
Thank you. So this agenda item reviews the direction provided by the Commission at the February 2019 meeting regarding those expectations for concurrent bilingual authorization candidates related how they will complete the TPA, and we're asking for additional discussion and guidance around the topic. So at that February 2019 meeting, the Commission discussed how a concurrent bilingual authorization candidate may complete the TPA with regard to the language of instruction and written and videotaped submissions. During that discussion, the Commission clarified 4 areas in question regarding concurrent bilingual candidates. The first one was that literacy is independent of a specific language, and that candidates may demonstrate their skills to provide literacy instruction in a language other than English. 2, that concurrent bilingual candidates should not be required to translate student work if they are providing instruction in a language other than English. 3, as part of the TPA, candidates must demonstrate the skills to teach English learners in English. And 4, that some or all of the TPA analysis and reflections need to be submitted in English. Based on that discussion, staff determined that there were no edits required to the existing assessment design standards in relation to the teaching of English learners and literacy. However, staff did identify additional concepts or elements that could be included into the assessment design standards to clarify the Commission's expectations at that February meeting. The first additional substandard would clarify that concurrent bilingual candidates not be required to translate the student work if they are providing instruction in a language other than English, and that multiple subject candidates may demonstrate their knowledge or their ability and skills to teach literacy in their language of instruction. And the second substandard that could be added to those ADS standards is that all candidates must demonstrate their ability to provide instruction to English learners in English. And you can actually find the full text of those drafted standards in page 2 of the item. And again, these areas were identified based on that discussion in February. So based on that, staff began to draft guidance to the field, which included 1, as part of the TPA, candidates must demonstrate the skill to teach an English learner in English. Staff had planned to provide guidance that candidates need to identify the relevant ELA and ELD standards being addressed within this instruction. And 2, that all candidates completing a TPA must submit their final analysis and reflections in English. So again, these 2 points summarize that discussion in February.
and staff began to discuss this guidance with representatives from CABE and CABTE. Leadership from both organizations expressed concerns regarding the requirements that ELD be provided in English to English learners, and that candidates be required to submit some or all of their written responses in English. So joining me at the table again are Ivania Soto, representing CABE, and Lynn Scott, representing CABTE. They're here to provide some comment and discussion about the implications on this guidance that was drafted. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to them now.
Okay, thank you. We'd like to thank the CTC staff, Terry and Miranda, for being collaborative, for taking a collaborative approach and including our feedback right throughout this item. What we have found is that teachers need clarification around the role of designated ELD in dual immersion programs due to the percentages in each language that they need to adhere to in order to represent the program model. Again, a review that designated ELD is that sacred time of the day, right, where English learners are able to experience the ELD standards, right? The ELD standards are at the forefront of instruction, but right, content can be utilized, right, to teach, to connect to those standards so that they're integrated. Bilingual researchers Beeman and Euro in their book Teaching for Biliteracy bring clarity to this issue by encouraging teachers to plan for what is called the bridge. So it's a time when cross-linguistic transfer and contrastive analysis between both languages can happen. So, for example, in a model lesson, if teachers are teaching the anatomy of an insect, let's say in Spanish, cognates or words that sound alike and have similar meanings can be pointed out, right, and discussed. So if we're using, right, in a dual immersion program, let's say it's a 50-50, right, in our 50-50 model, why would we not, right, utilize what has been addressed during our Spanish time, then and bring it into our designated ELD time? We're still addressing part 2 of the ELD standards by taking a look at academic vocabulary, right? By taking a look at cognates, right? Which are, again, words that sound alike, have similar meanings in 2 different languages. A similar kind of lesson can happen during the bridge, where let's say for part 2 of the ELD standards, we can contrast syntactical and grammatical components, right, of each language. So what we're trying to clarify is that during designated ELD, we can still use the primary language, right, to get to English. Right? There is a way to do that. And why would we abandon this rich asset, right? That's happening all day long. So that's CABE's, that's our clarification on the first item. For the second item, in terms of candidates should have the option to submit bilingually, we're recommending that the analyses not be entirely in English, because if our teacher candidates are discussing, let's say in that lesson that I just described, student language, right? And some of that student language might be in the primary language, right? That's an additional task to have to translate, let's say, academic vocabulary from one language to the other. So teachers may feel more comfortable using students' own authentic language, right, which may be in Spanish and not entirely in English. So those are kind of, right, the points of clarification that we want to make on the CABE side.
So what I'm hearing from different bilingual teacher educators in the field is when they read certain language, it will trigger certain expectations, either by mentor teachers, other teacher educators. So when you put in something like they must teach ELD in English, since we're coming out of 20 years of UNS, that sounds like exclusively in English. And what Dr. Soto is pointing out with this contextualization is there might be moments when you take a bilingual approach to leverage the cognates, or that you might use certain terms in a foreign language. And we wouldn't want future teachers, our teacher candidates, to say, I have to purify my instruction in ELD time to be in English. And this kind of goes back to what we're dealing with as an education process across the state. And further, is this notion like, well, if you're teaching English, wouldn't you just teach it exclusively in English? But we know that that is not research-based. And we've put in some of Goldenberg's research, Thomas and Collier, that really emphasize the teacher candidate needs a bilingual approach at their disposal. So some language that is helpful, if you look on page 5, Appendix A, it's on the left column, the third block down that starts developing. At the very end, it says that he or she has the skills to teach English learners in English. That's more problematic because it sounds exclusive. But look on the other side of the proposed guidance, and maybe we could use that guidance throughout. It says this must include working with the student in English. So that says, yes, you're teaching in English, as well as you may include the home language of the child. So we just don't want to provide this indication that teacher candidates must teach exclusively in English. And coming out of 20 years of UNS, there's still that notion in the field of exclusively in English. So that's one area to consider. We did find that in doing this process, and it's been great working with the staff to clarify this, that the World Languages rubric, which has already been field tested, has some appropriate language. And it says that current proficiency in reading, writing, and speaking, listening in English, and mastery of the target language and primary language. So see, it has that and oftentimes now we sometimes use the word dual language instruction to really emphasize we're talking about, yes, bilingual teachers, dual language teachers teach English language development and home language development. Not simply, there was a misnomer 20 or more years ago that the bilingual teacher was the monolingual teacher in Spanish. I don't know if anybody ever used the term like, oh, the bilingual students, and they really were talking about newcomers who didn't yet speak any English. But really, we're talking about dual language. So we want to use language that will indicate that we're including English, not exclusively in English. So there's just a few technicalities. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners, do you have any clarification questions? Oh, did you want to add something?
I was just going to wrap up the item, but I don't know. Okay. Thank you. Thank you to Ivania and Lynn for providing that. So staff asked the Commission to discuss CABE and COPTAID's concerns and provide feedback to each issue. This will provide clear direction to the staff so that we can provide guidance to the field for all TPA models. And based on today's discussion, draft language may or may not need to be included in the assessment design standards. This includes the presentation. Thank you.
And I will open it up for public comment because we do have one public comment card. And Janet Davis, if you will please come up and state your name and affiliation.
Good morning. This is Janet Davis. I'm representing the California Federation of Teachers. I was a bilingual teacher, I have a BCLAD, and I taught 20 of the 22 years I had in the classroom, even after 227. So this is something I feel very passionate about. I taught for LAUSD's teacher training program for bilingual education, and I worked on the LAUSD final plan for English learners. So I've been doing this and having the politics, fighting these politics for my entire career. This is a very happy time. So it's wonderful to see the politics fading, but because it's been hard to have effective programs and effective conversations when we had constant politics coming in there. Now that we can do it, it's still complicated because we have very different populations in California. I remember in Kern County, where I'm from, they had this great program I read about in Bakersfield, California, because they had the ability to innovate. They had a migrant population, and they were doing some really creative things. That's one situation. You have different situations where you have a very small population of the target language, students speaking the target language. That's going to require a different approach. There are very many ways, research-based ways, to do an effective program, and I'm so happy to see a research-based approach, and I was really pleased to hear the comments by my colleagues, because I think the organic part of speaking both languages allows you to take that teachable moment, especially when you have something like Spanish and English where the cognates are your friends, and can make learning happen immediately, because they can just say, oh, it's just like that, got it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And now, commissioners, do you have any clarification questions for presenters? Okay, seeing no clarification questions, I will call for a motion, because this is an action item, correct? All right. So the action, one, there are actually 4 parts to this. Director Sandy, should we vote on one motion with all 4 parts? Would that, or a separate motion for each?
The recommendation number 1, I think, is probably the product of your discussion and your final action, and doesn't necessarily need a motion. We're simply asking you to discuss and help us provide clarity to the field that reflects your direction. But ultimately, the actions that we're seeking are to adopt additional language for the assessment design standard, either as proposed or amended based on the conversation that you have, and then set a deadline as suggested in recommendation 3. And we can take as staff direction that whatever the outcome of this discussion and action, we will provide some guidance for the field on this. So really, recommendations 2 and 3 are the subject of a direct action by the Commission. And I believe what you're asking is to open the motion so that we can discuss and amend within the discussion, and then take action. Right. Okay.
Okay. Did everybody get that? All right. Do we have a motion to accept the recommendations proposed by CABE and CABTE's recommendation? Okay. Moved by Commissioner Sloan, seconded by Commissioner Klatt. All right, so we have a motion and a second. Any discussion, commissioners? Commissioner Sloan?
So thank you for this item. Thank you, all of you, for working on this. This is very important. It's always been something that hasn't been clear for bilingual candidates, and particularly around the TPA. We never wanted certain candidates to have more work as a result of the credential area that they're working in. So by ensuring that bilingual teacher candidates do not need to translate and transcripts and all of these things is very important and a good move forward. And so I just wanted to clarify for candidates, and I know that we will be giving them more information in the field, but with respect to the TPA, I think what I am hearing is that the instructional artifacts, anything that a candidate uses to teach in a classroom, and the assessments that the students do, or any of the work that the students do that are in a language other than English, can remain in the language other than English. But it is those additional things that a teacher candidate would do for the TPA that gives assessors insight into their thinking and their decision making that we would want to see in English. In other words, if they're doing an analysis of what their students have learned, that can be in English because it is their reflections on what they're learning. If they are doing a reflection on what overall they're teaching the quality of their teaching and what they might do next and what their next steps are. That can be in English, because those are not necessarily the things that they are creating for teaching at that moment in time. Does that seem to be a correct clarification?
Yeah.
Yes.
From your previous board meeting, I remember at the end, former chair Linda Darling Hammond said, they should be able to show that they can write in English, and that was kind of the purpose of that final reflection or those reflections. So what you've just expressed, that if it's student artifacts, it's instructional video, like they could, we would like you to affirm that, yes, candidates can take a bilingual approach. That is research-based. But if you so decide that in addition to that, candidates then provide their reflection in English, including any bilingual artifacts from instruction, that to me, that would be great. That would be great. We're just concerned we don't want to lead candidates to think they have to purify the lesson that they give in ELD to be exclusively in English.
Right.
I guess my caveat to that is that that it shouldn't be entirely, it doesn't have to be entirely in English. So if a teacher is reflecting upon, in the final reflection, around student language, right, that is in Spanish, perhaps, because the student organically used, right, the primary language during designated ELD, let's say, we don't want that to count against, right, the candidate if the teacher is citing, right, student language in his or her reflection.
Right.
So that's the only clarification.
No, I think, staff are on that. My other understanding, as I'm learning about this better as well, is that oftentimes bilingual teachers or dual language settings might do their planning in another language as well, and because they're thinking in that language, they're doing that. So again, I would think that is an artifact that they're using in their teaching. Their lesson plans that they create to teach that lesson, they should be allowed to do it authentically the way they would do it. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Commissioners? Yes, Commissioner Klatt.
I have a quick question, maybe from stakeholders or from staff. The staff recommendation for number 3 says that the suggested date, the deadline would be September 1st, 2019, which seems soon, especially since summer's happening and a lot of people might be around. So I'm just curious if that date feels appropriate. Are there unintended consequences for having the date that soon or not?
I think the intention is to provide the guidance to all the TPA models so that they're clear on the Commission's expectations and so that they can have that implemented for the next year by September 1st.
For bilingual teacher educators, we were anticipating something by July 1st of this year because we need something. So that's been our timeline. That's why we're here today.
So it's a good thing that it's
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Commissioners, any other questions or comments? Okay, so we do have a motion, and yes.
So the analysis and reflections are in English. They can cite the student's language if that's being used throughout. The lesson planning assessment in the language of instruction. What about the instruction to English learners? What's exclusively in English, or get some, or the bilingual approach that Ivania and Lynn discussed? If I can get some clarification there.
That's great. This is exactly what we were needing. So thank you.
I think that I'll speak for myself. Other commissioners can chime in, but the research-based opportunities to implement instruction in ways that are most effective are the ways that we want to be sure that we are allowing for. And so providing that clarity in our instructions to candidates. It was useful to hear that some of the language might trigger something based on what we've thought of in the past. So I think it is important that we can use the bridge and the kinds of methods that were discussed here at the table. I don't know if others have anything to add.
No? Did that make sense? Is that clear? Yes? Okay.
Like, 1P states that concurrent bilingual candidates, that they're not required to translate student work or provide English transcriptions, and that they must ensure that multiple subject candidates demonstrate teaching literacy in a language other than English, that's okay. Do we want to include that in assessment design standards? It looks like 1Q is not appropriate anymore because we're not saying that ELD is exclusively in English. So
I believe that's correct.
Commissioners, I will just, fill the time while she's taking her seat. That, we had a very robust conversation at our last commission meeting about this, and emerged thinking we had clarity, and that idea dissipated fairly quickly. And so we've come back with this item seeking clarity, and we think that actually being explicit in the standards is necessary in order for us to provide guidance to the field. So I think we'd like to keep these amendments on the table. If you need to adjust them in any way to further clarify, that would be great, but I would like to see us adopt them if that's your will.
You summarized that extremely well, Executive Director Sandy. A number of us listened to that February meeting a number of times to try to draft the guidance, and we then finally decided we just really needed to be more clear. And 1P is in there specifically so all models understand, all programs understand, and all candidates understand that they can't be required to do that additional work of translating or transcribing. 1Q is clarifying your request that the writing is in English. I believe I heard Dr. Scott talk about final analysis and reflections primarily in English or in the majority in English, but to make it clear that if you put in a word from the other language, it is not going to cause you to have a condition code and have your TPA rejected. So I'm not sure if 1Q you want to adopt it the way it is, or if you want to add the word primarily in English is another option for you to consider. But we do think these two elements being added to the assessment design standards will make it actually clear to everyone.
I think 1P is fine. It's just this question about when you put in English. But it just primarily in English would be fine. And that gives guidance to the bilingual assessors. And one positive thing from this is that as you're looking at all of the design standards, as you call them, assessment design standards, this refers to the EdTPA and the FAST, etc., which Executive Director Sandy has received multiple letters through the years that from the field and from us that will really help give guidance to all TPAs. Great.
And I agree, and just that, so for 1Q, where it says in English, that it would be not exclusively in English, that teacher candidates would understand that, right, if they're citing student language or, let's say, a particular methodological approach, right, that maybe is in the bilingual setting, that they can use that language, carry it over in their reflections and not have to translate it. Yeah.
Commissioner Sloan and then Commissioner Alavi.
So I think these examples are important to provide guidance for assessment designers because, as Dr. Scott mentioned, the assessment design standards are not just for Cal TPA, they are for all TPAs that are approved for the state of California, for use in the state of California. We want to be sure that the designers understand what's appropriate so that they do appropriate score training. And so while I do know that we have this language that is just what's in the standards, there's technical assistance for designers as well. And I think you're going to say something.
And this language has been shared with all the commission-approved models, and they've all said that they can make this work. So the EdTPA FAST does know about this, and they're comfortable with it.
Commissioner Allaby?
So I'm just asking whether or not we need a modification to the motion that adds the word primarily. And whoever the motion maker is, I'm not sure.
So I wonder if I can offer us a summary of what I think your motion is and see if that is acceptable to the mover and seconder. So what I think I'm hearing is a motion to adopt the amendments 1P and 1Q with the amendment of the word primarily in front of the word English in the last line of 1Q, and to adopt these amendments thus. And I think further to set the date for implementation of this with all performance assessments of September 1st, 2019. I think that's what we're asking you to move and second and take action on. But I may have missed something.
And Commissioner Allaby, you
okay,
right? Okay, and then Commissioner Klatt, you seconded the motion, right? So, oh, you okay? All right. So, are you in agreement with the modification?
Yes.
Okay.
Can I make a friendly suggestion? I wonder if it's primarily or predominantly. As I'm listening to the discussion, because I think primarily opens up more than what I heard you talking about, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering, predominantly indicates.
Yeah. Again, yeah. I mean, it's this wordsmithing. That's what it is. It's important, but you know, yeah. I don't know if you even just drop the in English and just say research-based strategies. See, again, I think we're back to that. So I think predominantly to me sounds more towards exclusively than primarily, but
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, primarily is more inclusive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Commissioner Hartwig?
May I just ask one question, which is, Emma, is there something beyond, I'm not familiar with this field at all, so please enlighten me if not, but is there something that we're really talking about that is beyond cited material that would be in a different language? Such that really, whereas I see primarily, to me, when I read it like that, if I didn't know the other context, to me, could indicate that some of your reflection itself might be in the other language. Whereas if we included something that was a clause that said, except for source material cited in an additional language, or something like that, if that is what it is that we're really concerned about, is that more appropriate because that reflects what the concerns are about what should be able to continue to be in the other language?
But I think we said, so it's not just the source materials, it's also student language, right? Because teachers reflect upon, hopefully, right, on students and their learning and their language, especially when you're talking about, right, a dual immersion model where language is at the center, two languages, right, are at the center. So I know when I work with my teachers with their TPAs, we want their reflections to be truly, deep reflections, and taking a look at student language is an authentic way to do that. So I'm just concerned if it's just the artifacts, right, then teachers might feel restricted that they can't use that rich resource in their reflections.
So can I just add to that? I think Commissioner Hartwig and commissioners, we are making a fairly significant shift in our requirements for assessing bilingual candidates with these standards. It used to be that everything had to be translated. So we're moving to non-translation of student work, and this is kind of the first pass to try and capture all the different types of settings in which a concurrently enrolled bilingual candidate might be delivering services, instructional services. I think it's challenging to get too specific about what the exceptions would be at this stage because we haven't seen them all yet. This is a growing field now, and we hope that we're going to see more bilingual candidates coming through performance assessments. So I think settling on the word primarily or predominantly allows some flexibility. We know that these candidates will be scored by people who are certified to score in the language of instruction, And so we don't expect it's going to present a challenge to them. But I think that as your discussion at the last meeting really surfaced, that having not landing all of your eggs in one basket, one language basket, is an important part of this. So establishing an expectation that there's both English and language of instruction allowed here is important. So that's my perspective on it.
Okay, so let's call Commissioner Sloan.
One thing I just wanted to say was that I think this is a big moment. This is really important that we are moving in this direction. It's signaling the importance of multilingualism, and because it is an added burden on TPA designers and assessors to ensure that all assessors have the requisite language background to be able to do the kind of evaluation that they need to do. And it's really important. It's important that we are now saying we value people who speak multiple languages, what they bring to the classroom, what they bring to the education of all people. So I'm very, very glad to see this. I have one minor potential amendment. Under 1Q, the very end of that sentence says the candidate must submit a final analysis and reflections in English. I'm not sure it's just the final, correct? There are other analyses, or is final
You could clearly remove the word final there if you wish. As we've looked at, and I'm most familiar also with the Cal TPA. For example, in Instructional Cycle 1, there is some analysis of the students in your classroom, the strengths those students bring, the challenges they have. And that is not planning for a lesson or anything like that. So if you wanted to remove the word final, so it would read, each candidate must submit his or her analyses and reflections primarily in English, is how that sentence would read. It could be in that approach.
There would be primarily twice in that sentence.
Okay.
No, teaching an English learner primarily in English in the second line, and then at the end. Is that what you're thinking?
Submit.
What Terry was saying at the end, but have you already inserted primarily earlier in the sentence?
They were not suggesting adding primarily to the first sentence. And I know I heard you talk before, Dr. Scott, about wanting it to be understood that you're teaching the English learner in English, but you wanted there to be some flexibility in a bilingual manner. But that's not where we were putting primarily. We were always looking at putting it in the second sentence. So if you're suggesting something for the first sentence, that needs to be more clear.
I was suggesting it was the first sentence. Yeah, we thought the primarily was about teaching an English learner primarily in English. Because again, it's that in English that seems exclusive. So we interpret that as they're teaching, they must teach ELD exclusively in English.
And that's where I thought the primarily was as well, actually.
So you could modify that first in English by saying with use of the language of instruction as necessary, and thereby get both, and save the word primarily for the last line. I know this is that if that's acceptable?
Got that?
On page 5 of your document, that third box on the right does say this must include working with the student in English. So I think that captures what Director Sandy's saying.
With use
of the language of instruction is what I was suggesting.
So we have language. Should we go over the modified motion?
Yeah.
All right.
Yes.
And then we'll call for vote.
Let me. Do you want me to see if I've got it, or do you think you have it? You want to restate your motion, Madam Chair?
You can correct me as needed. So modification of the motion then, is 1Q the only area where it needs modification? All right, so it will now read, all candidates must demonstrate as part of the TPA effective strategies teaching an English learner with use of the language of instruction as appropriate. I'm sorry. I'm going to start again. All right. All candidates must demonstrate as part of the TPA effective strategies teaching an English learner in English with use of the language of instruction as appropriate within the content area of the intended credential. Each candidate must submit his or her analysis and reflections primarily in English.
Oh, that's great.
All right.
That's great.
Okay.
Commissioner Klatt? Okay. All right. So we have a motion and a second. Now we'll call for a vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Anyone opposed? Abstentions? Okay. Motion carries. Thank you. Yes, Commissioner Cooney just said, that we'll see this again in August for clarification. Pero clarificación en español. Okay. Okay, moving on. Item 2D is proposed adoption of passing score standards for the redeveloped California Teaching Performance Assessment. This item is being presented by Amy Rising, Wayne Baser, is that correct? Heather Klesch from Evaluation Systems Group of Pearson. This is an action item. Ms. Rising, will you please begin?
We have a few slides, so we want to make sure that we can access them. Thank you. All right. Good morning, commissioners. So I'm joined this morning by my colleagues Wayne Baser, consultant here with the Performance Assessment Development Team, and Dr. Heather Klesch from our Technical Contractor Evaluation Systems Group of Pearson. We will be collaboratively sharing this item with you this morning. So this agenda item provides foundational information about the standard setting process for commission developed exams and assessments, and then also offers a recommendation for a passing score standard for the redeveloped California Teaching Performance Assessment, or the Cal TPA. The commission redeveloped its model, the Cal TPA, during 2016 to 2018 and into 2018-19. And we have several appendices for you that lay out all of the work that has been going on for the last now almost 4 years. As August begins my 5th year back here at the Commission, it's been a lot of work over the last 4 years. So we wanted to make sure, though, that you understood who all the different panels and teams that have worked on this are referenced. So your Appendix A gives you the design team membership. We had 21 members. We also wanted to give you the graphic again that shows all of the interaction that happens between all of these teams as we moved along through the development of this assessment. And then the list of preparation programs that have come alongside in the pilot and the field tests and are now using the Cal TPA are provided for you in Appendix C. And then finally, the standard setting panel, our last group that we pulled together of 21 members that ended up as 20, and that is provided in Appendix D. And ENF provide additional material, the passing standard qualities and activities that the panel went through are in Appendix E, and in Appendix F we get into the standard error of measure tables. So lots of information in your appendix. We also provided an additional set of data for you in your item that some of you may have also accessed, and we're happy, of course, to talk about any and all of that. But this morning we'll primarily stick to the information provided in the body of the item itself. So we had to redevelop the Cal TPA for several key reasons, including Common Core coming along, next generation science standards coming along, our embracement of bilingual education, for example, and of course the redeveloped teaching performance expectations that laid out additional expectations for new teachers, including things like the use of educational technology and developing global digital citizens, social and emotional development, and support of the whole child. So lots of good reasons for why we needed to do this work. To also make sure that we could feed this data into our developing accreditation data system that's coming along, we wanted to make sure that we had a valid and reliable set of outcome data. And so, again, we had to make some decisions about the model that the Commission sponsors, and that led us to having a centralized process, an online system, and scoring that was conducted by calibrated subject-specific assessors this time, and also language proficient assessors, so that we could support all of our candidates as they came through our multiple subject and single subject programs. Also, we wanted to make sure that candidates were getting very specific and detailed feedback about their performance of teaching, and so we needed to make sure that that was also happening, and that candidates would be getting, and programs, this feedback as well as the Commission, within 3 weeks. So we have a 3-week turnaround time for when a candidate submits, and then it is assessed by a calibrated assessor, and then that data is returned. So as I said, we moved through our development with our design team. We pilot tested that work with 25 or so of our programs. In our field test the following year, we had 27 programs, and we iterated again. And then we moved this year through our first administration, and we are iterating a little bit again as we align this complex work to make sure that it's clear to candidates and programs about the expectations for performance. So that brought us to this very important day where we are in front of you to ask for your consideration of and adoption of a passing standard that we would then hold candidates to as we move into this next administration. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Wayne Baser, who will take us through more definition and description and background history of the TPA itself, and also the standard setting process.
Thank you, Amy. Just wanted to give you a little bit of a recap on the provisional passing standard that came into play during the redevelopment of the Cal TPA for the pilot tests and also for the field testing. As Amy indicated, back in 2017, we had 24 institutions and 250 candidates participated in the pilot test. So what we learned from the pilot test, we went back and we revamped the Cal TPA. Then we went into a field test. We had 27 additional programs during the 2017-18 academic year participated in that. And what we learned from the field test, we went back and we revamped the Cal TPA again. And then we went into statewide operational administration just this past fall of 2018. So if you remember back in December of 2017, the Commission adopted an expected performance level for the Cal TPA for all candidates that participated in the field test. So preparation programs that were included in the field test were granted a waiver for their candidates who took the redeveloped Cal TPA. And so this allowed passage of the redeveloped Cal TPA to meet the statutory requirement that candidates pass a Commission-approved TPA. So the waiver provisional passing standard that was set by the Commission was a minimum score of 2 on each rubric with no more than 1 rubric score of 1 allowable, and this was for each cycle 1 and cycle 2. So the purpose of the standard setting for all candidates who completed cycle submissions that were submitted and scored from fall of 2018 through April 25th, 2019 were included in the data analysis. So this sort of gives you, next slide is sort of a recap of how many candidates went through and completed the Cal TPA during that piece of time. And this is a breakdown from cycle 1 and cycle 2, multiple and single subject. And we did have a 97% pass rate for all those candidates through that piece of time. So this is the data set that we looked at when we went through the standard setting process. So at this time, I'd like to sort of give you an overview of that standard setting process. So standard setting sort of is a common term used in large-scale assessments or to describe the process of determining a minimum passing score or what we call a cut score. So the term standard, as used in standard setting, usually refers to performance assessment, or a minimal level of acceptable performance. Standard setting is a common established process for determining valid and defensible minimum passing scores in standardized assessments. So it allows for an authoritative body, in this case the Commission, to make an informed decision when establishing cut scores. So standard setting is really content focused. It's a structured process in which panel content experts review content of an assessment. They consider performance expectations being measured, relevant data, potential pass rates at various cut scores, to make an informed judgment about the minimum passing level of candidate would need to in order to pass the assessment. So the standard setting process was conducted by Evaluation Systems Group of Pearson and resulted in a recommendation cut score from the X group panel to the Commission on both the instructional cycles. So the process employed for the Cal TPA was consistent with recognized psychometric principles and procedures, and the standard setting study was conducted over a 2-day period back on May 8th and 9th of this year. And then the participants all went through some preparatory activities and that took place just prior to that meeting. In addition to that, we also had 15 PSD staff members that were also in attendance during those 2 days. So the specific standard setting process, the detail of all that, is really described fully in Appendix E. So you have that for you to look at. So the initial and passing recommendations that the expert panel used was really framed by a context statement and a guiding question, and I'll put those up here for you. So basically think about a teacher candidate who is just at the level of knowledge and skills required to perform effectively the job of a new teacher in California. So we're looking at new teacher proficiencies. And the question is, what score, the sum of all the rubric scores in the cycle, represents the level of performance that would be achieved by this individual? So the guiding question addressed candidate performance really was across all the rubrics in each cycle. So cycle 1 has 8 rubrics and cycle 2 has 9 rubrics. So a discussion was also conducted to allow panel recommendations for any possible side conditions. So an example might be placing a limitation on the number of score level 1s that would be accepted. Or ultimately, for the final passing score. So Amy's going to sort of give you an overview of the rubrics and have an idea of what that looks like. So Amy, go ahead.
All right. So we wanted to be sure that there was an understanding about these analytic rubrics. So in our pilot test, we had begun with more holistic rubrics where there's sort of a general review of practice and a determination based on a preponderance of data kind of approach. And really at the end of the pilot, it was pretty clear in the feedback from our programs and candidates and assessors that we needed more specificity. So that summer we moved into the development of what are called analytic rubrics. So there are 8 analytic rubrics for cycle 1. There are 9 analytic rubrics for cycle 2. So over the experience of this formative assessment where you complete and get your scores back on cycle 1, and then you move on and complete cycle 2 and get that feedback, at the conclusion of that experience, a candidate now has 17 very complex points of performance description from which then they can work with coaches and mentors and others in the field to continue to work on improving their practice. So what you have up on the slide right now is just a reminder about the 2 instructional cycles. In our first cycle, we're asking candidates to learn about students and plan instruction, and that is for one group of students and one lesson. And they do get up on their feet and teach that lesson and videotape that and reflect and analyze on that instructional planning. And they have 3 focus students that they consider in their work along with the whole group instruction. And then we get to cycle 2 later in their experience where it's more complex and involved, in which case they're looking at assessment. So assessment-driven instruction. We ask candidates to look at 3 to 5 lessons and dig into really understanding measurement of student knowledge, skill, and ability. So they look at informal assessments that they're doing across a series of lessons. They're looking at student self-assessment, an area in which students are in the position of making judgments about their own qualities of their own work, and then understanding next steps, and then finally a formal assessment where there is some kind of product, process, or performance required of each individual student that then the candidate looks across that data and thinks about qualities of performance up against learning goals. They look at all three of those measures and then determine what next lesson they might teach. And then they literally have to teach that. So there's no reflection about what I might do. It's really what are you going to do, and then show us yourself doing that. And that's cycle 2. And so again, each cycle has 4 key steps, and rubrics are tied to each step. So plan is our first step. Teach and assess is our second, where they're up on their feet teaching and videotaping and annotating those videos. They reflect on their practice, and then they apply that forward to the next instruction for those students. So next slide gives us the rubric. Yes, these are 5-level rubrics. We're just showing you one of the 17 so that you can be reminded of the complexity and how these work. So when we train assessors, they first read what we call the essential question. And the essential question guides the assessor, the candidate, and the program around what we are measuring and looking for in performance. So this happens to be rubric 1.6, and it gets at the notion of how the candidate is actively engaging students in deep learning. And we were just talking about aspects of deep learning, and you can see that in this work, a lot of that concept of hands-on learning, deep learning, is already woven throughout all of this work. Anyway, 3 levels. So the assessors read that essential question, as we hope the candidates are doing, and then we go right to level 3. So the language in level 3 is a reflection of, an illustration of the essential question, and it's made up of multiple constructs. So an assessor looks at that language in level 3 and says, do I have evidence of every construct that is listed in level 3? If the answer is yes, I have evidence, I have evidence, I have evidence, then they can start considering whether or not the performance is at a level 4. So they read through that language, and if they have all of level 3 and all of level 4, then they can pause and say, well, do I have evidence of a level 5 performance? And if they have all of what is listed in level 5, all that's listed in level 4 and 3, then they would end up at a score level of 5. Now, if they read through level 3 and realize that something is missing, they do not have evidence of one of the constructs, they now need to consider, is this a level 2 performance? And if it is a level 2 performance, great, it's a level 2 performance. But if something is missing, again, in the constructs provided in level 2, now we're into consideration of whether or not this is a performance at a level 1. So this process of this kind of deep analysis of the evidence provided by the candidate, and often it's multiple sources of evidence that are looked at, and that's cited at the bottom of each rubric, what the assessor looks at for the evidence, and candidates should know this as well as programs support them in the work. And on we go. So that's the process for each analytic rubric. And again, remember, we have 8 of them in cycle 1 and 9 of them in cycle 2. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Wayne.
Okay, thanks, Amy. So let's take a look at the initial passing score recommendation from the panel. So through a facilitated discussion, panelists were presented with CalTPA descriptive data. The activities described in Appendix C were conducted, and each panelist recommended an initial passing score during the early part of the 2-day process. So to arrive at the final standard setting passing standard recommended to the Commission, panelists were then provided with descriptive and summary data to help with their recommendations. So descriptive and summary data would include the number of submissions scored in each CalTPA cycle and content area, a summary of the aggregate data for each cycle and the step of the cycle, total CalTPA performance, which included mean, standard deviation, median, minimum, and maximum scores. So these performance descriptive statistics were provided in both aggregate and broken out by rubric for each of the CalTPA cycles and content area. So demographics and total score descriptive performance statistics, so number, percent, mean, standard deviation, median, minimum and maximum score, were also provided by gender, ethnicity, placement setting, and candidate primary language. So finally, the distribution of total scores were provided for the complete data set. So after reviewing the descriptive and summary data and following discussion with the whole group, panelists were asked to make an initial recommendation for a cut score. as well as a recommendation regarding any setting or condition for that cut score. So the initial cut score recommendations were as followed. So for cycle 1, remember, which has 8 rubrics, initial cut score was the initial committee recommended mean, and all panelists recommended a side condition. So 15 of them recommended no allowance of rubric score 1, and 5 recommended allowing one score rubric of 1. For cycle 2, which has 9 rubrics, initial cut score of 21 points was the initial committee recommended median, and all the panelists recommended a side condition, once again with 15 of them recommending no allowance for score level 1 and 5 recommending allowing one rubric of score level 1. So that was their initial. So panelists were then shown frequency for the initial recommendation of the cut score, as well as mean, median, mode, minimum, maximum for the initial cut score recommendation. And they were also shown a summary of the condition recommendations, both for frequency and associated recommendations. So let's take a look at the final passing recommendation. So again, through facilitated discussion, after examining the initial recommendations, panelists were presented with the CalGPA impact data, which reflected the number and percentage of candidates who would theoretically pass each potential recommended level at a passing score that was ultimately recommended by each panelist. So on tables 1 and 2 on pages 4 of 5 of the agenda items, you can take a look at those, shows the rubric level scores by content area for cycle 1 and cycle 2 during the first year of implementation. And the rubric scores are shown our first year attempt at the passing cycle. So just to take a look at the first field, we're not going to look at all the data here, but as you can see in multiple subject, there were 1,607 candidates. The mean score was 23.8, standard deviation 4.78, a median of 23, minimum score of 9, and a maximum score of 40. So you can see that breakdown for cycle 1 for the 2 multiple subject areas and also for all the additional single subject areas. And then the second table does the same breakdown for cycle 2. So Heather's going to then talk about a frequency distribution of cycle 1 and cycle 2 scores, and so turn over to Heather.
Oh, there we go. On page 7 shows these frequency distributions. And I'll just note, while data is obviously, it's interesting to see, we don't lead with the data in standard setting. We brought folks together to really be able to look at actual candidate submissions at varying levels of performance. And before we dove into, well, how did everybody actually do and what would be the impact of your decision, we wanted to be sure to have rich discussion around those actual exemplars of performance. So the 2 days that we spent here in this room around the table wasn't just focusing on data and what percent would pass if we set a cut score here, et cetera. It was really looking at, well, how did candidate performance actually look at this level, at that level, at these different rubric score point descriptions. So while we're jumping to the data here, I just wanted to frame for you really the iterative process that led through those 2 days here. So this is a frequency distribution for cycle, let's go back one. This is cycle 2. Cycle 1. So in this case, what we're just showing you is essentially the distribution of the scores for all candidates that submitted for cycle 1, and if where the panel recommendation is, in this case, cycle 1 is at a total score of 19 out of the 8 rubrics. You have about 92% of the candidates meeting or exceeding that score of 19, which is about 4,100 who took cycle 1. Cycle 2, the frequency distribution shows you, now we have one more rubric, so we have 5 more points that are available for candidates. The recommendation on cycle 2 was a total score of 21, which at that point, about 94% of our candidates met or exceeded that score, 1,700 total. So this is important to see because when we talk about the standard error of measurement, which is another consideration here, and this is a consideration that the Commission has always entertained in any of its assessments in terms of, well, what would be the impact of if we set a cut score at this point? What about the people that are just below that? Are we confident that they were truly at an 18, right below a cut score of 19? Are we confident that they're truly at a score of 20, right below the 21? Or might we have some false negatives in there. That they actually, if they were to retake this or to test again, that we would expect that there may be a difference in their performance. And we do. We always know that there is measurement error in assessments. And so we present the standard error of measurement as a statistical adjustment that you can choose to apply either as a whole or as a part. And this calculation showed that a standard error of measurement is about 4 points. It is a large band. So what we've presented for you in these tables show the impact of taking the committee recommendation or looking at the impact to candidates going half an SEM down or a full SEM down, because we want to be able to frame that entire impact for your consideration.
So after reviewing the impact data, the whole group discussed the inferences of the impact data on the initial passing score recommendation, and following the discussion, panelists were asked then to make a final recommendation for the cut score by individual cycle. And so for cycle 1, once again for 8 rubrics, the final cut score was 19 points, was the committee recommended median. 19 of the 20 panelists recommended a condition, with 14 recommending not allowing a rubric score of 1 and 5 were recommending allowing 1 rubric score of 1. For cycle 2, which once again has 9 rubrics, a final cut score of 21 points was the committee recommended median. 19 of the panelists recommended a condition, with 14 recommending not allowing a rubric score of 1 and 5 recommending allowing 1 rubric score of 1. So to conclude the meeting, panelists were then shown the frequency for the individual ratings for the final recommendation cut score, as well as the mean, median, mode, minimum, and maximum for the final cut score recommendations. And once again, those are presented in table 1 and 2 that we looked at on pages 4 and 5. Panelists were also shown a summary of the condition recommendations, both the frequency and associated recommendation, and these tables are presented in the agenda item on page 8, and additional standard error of measurement impact tables are provided in Appendix F. So you can see from table 3 that it's highlighted there, the median for cycle 1 is 19, and then the median score for cycle 2 was 20. 21, yeah, excuse me. So I'd like to turn this back over to Heather, who's going to discuss consideration for standard error of measurement.
So I mentioned the standard error of measurement. I'd actually like to move to on page 10 of your item. We provided another modeling for you, which we've been talking about cycle 1 and cycle 2. They are 2 independent TPA cycles that are passed individually. So what we wanted to look at, though, is then, well, what's the impact of if cut score for cycle 1 was here and cut score for cycle 2 was there for the candidates that actually took both cycles? What would that mean at a total passing level? So these charts that start on page 10 model for you if cycle 1's cut score were at a cut score of 19, the panel recommended median, and cycle 2's cut score was at a cut score of 21, the panel recommended median. 87% of the candidates in this poll, which is about 1,800 candidates who took cycle 1 and cycle 2, would have passed. And this particular table 4 has no side conditions. So that means that that could include a number of ones. There's no condition. It's just based on their total score. We modeled that for you in tables 5 and 6, adding in the discussion that we had here at the table about how many ones do we want to allow a candidate to obtain. So table 5 brings into play the allowance of no more than 1, but 1 in cycle 1 and cycle 2. So each of the cycles could have a rubric score of 1. And as you can see there, the passing rate at a cut score of 19 cycle 1 and 21 cycle 2 is still at 87%. So there really isn't actually an impact at that point for these candidates who took each of the cycles. But then when you move to table 6, which says, well, what if we said no ones allowed in either of the cycles? Any cycle, there's no 1, because that is in the spirit of the committee's recommendation around how many ones should be allowed. And you can see that there is an impact resulting in this case, 78% passing at a cut score of 19 and 21, respectively, for cycle 1 and 2.
Hey, Amy?
Back to me.
It's back to you, right?
Okay. We're working a little
Nope.
technical
The
difficulty.
flashing screen is a bit annoying, so we're trying to fix that. We do apologize.
No reflect. No.
Wasn't really part of the presentation.
No reflection on the Cal TPA.
Yeah. This is why it's
Look here.
That's right. So, at the final stage of the standard setting process, the panel arrived at the following recommendations for scores for Cycle 1 and Cycle 2. In addition, the majority of panelists were recommended no scores of 1 on any rubric would be allowed. So the expert panelist recommendation for the commission is as follows. Cycle 1, 8 rubrics, a final score of 19 with no scores of 1. And Cycle 2, with 9 rubrics, a final cut score of 21 points with no scores of 1. And so for your consideration, we give you printed copy score profiles. So if you take a look at those, you'll see that we have one, it says Mathematics Cycle 1. And if you take a look at that, we'll focus on Cycle 1 first. And if you look at the far right-hand column, it shows a breakdown of the scores. So predominantly this candidate got mostly score level 2s and 3s, and you can see what a submission would look like with one score level of 1, and that totals to be 19, which was the recommendation. The second one is for single subject science, Cycle 2, basically the same kind of breakdown. Most of the scores are 2s and 3s and does have one score of 1 and does meet the recommended passing score of 21. So just give you an example of what that, any possible, lots of different combinations of what that could look like, but just one possible example for both of the cycles.
All right. So the other thing to note is that this is what a score report looks like that a candidate receives. So they get all of the detailed language and can kind of see that profile of practice as well as the number that has to be assigned. So while the panel was very deliberative and very careful in its thinking and looked at lots and lots of data with us over 2 days and made their recommendation, staff then took that recommendation and had additional conversations. And when we began to see the modeled data, when we looked at both Cycle 1 and Cycle 2 with the side condition of no ones, we needed to continue to think about impact, really. And when we looked back and saw that really in our pilot and in our field test, while the door was wide open and we invited all to participate, only 25 of the 60 programs and then 27 of the 60 programs were able to do that with us at that time. So we realized this first year of administration was still the majority of our programs were using these materials, this assessment process for the very first time. And so we wanted to keep that front and center as we thought about a recommendation. So while as staff we deeply appreciate the time and effort that the panel put in and their recommendation is very valid and important to us and in our deliberation, we do want to recommend, however, that we take a slightly different approach here for a standard. So the staff recommends that the Commission adopt the following as a passing standard for the 1920 year, effective as of August 23rd, 2019. And that is this recommendation, that Cycle 1, those 8 rubrics, would have a final cut score of 19 points with one score of 1 allowed. One score of 1 allowed. And for Cycle 2, that we would take the recommendation from the panel of 21 points, but again, allow one score of 1. We recommend this as staff to you for the next 2 years so that programs can continue to develop, support candidates, think about field placement and support during the performance of teaching, and also have a robust requirement. Remember, the level score of 3 is a quality performance, and 4 and 5 takes us into really effective teaching. So the score points of 19 and 21 feel like something we're still reaching for, frankly. And the notion of having that one score of 1 allowed supports candidates and programs in continuing to build their practice. So that is our recommendation. In 2 years, we would return to you with additional data and give you back that opportunity of looking at that data with us and reconsidering a passing standard that you might want to keep or reset at that time. So in addition to the 19 and 21 and the 1 score of 1 for each cycle, we also, as staff, are not recommending that you apply an SEM at this time, since there really was no real difference, and Heather can talk more about that. So for next steps, if you were to adopt the recommendation of 19 and 21 with 1 score of 1 on each cycle allowed, we would, of course, then share that with the field and support the work in an ongoing way, as we have been doing through our weekly conversations and our monthly online learning community and our webinars and all of our assessor training. So the passing standard adopted by the Commission would then be applied to all candidates as of the August 23rd start date for that group of candidates coming in at that time and moving forward through the next 2 years until we were back with you to share more data. So with that, we are happy to take any questions, and that concludes our item. Thank you.
I will open up for public comment, and we do have one public comment card. Rigel Massaro. Good morning.
Good morning, Commissioners. Rigel Massaro with Public Advocates. Public Advocates is highly concerned about quality teachers and also a diverse teacher workforce that reflects the students of our state. We appreciate in the appendix the breakdowns by gender and race and ethnicity for each cycle and for different passing rates. And they're a little hard to find. They haven't been front and center in this discussion, so I would just love to hear the assessment of those breakdowns. If you can put in the word gender or race and search and find them pretty quickly, or you can go to pages 44, 61, 93, and 109. So I'd love to hear the discussion of those discrepancies. I'm not a statistician, so I do see discrepancies, and some stand out more than others, and certainly the passing rates, the cut scores matter. And I guess I would have appreciated a more, maybe one of the charts on the frequency distribution for gender and race and ethnicity, or at least for the extremes, or on the candidates we know are underrepresented in our teaching profession. I really appreciate staff's thinking around the impact and the implementation, support the idea of an initial adoption and reflection in 2 years, and would urge that reflection in 2 years bring race, gender, and ethnicity more to the fore of this discussion, just so we are aware. Hopefully we are not having a biased impact, and just being aware that discrepancies do exist pretty much in any testing scheme we do. The TPA is the test that our organization understands is the most correlated to quality teaching, and we therefore think it's the most important of our assessments for teachers, and want to be sure that we are doing everything we can to make it accessible to all students, all teacher candidates. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're happy to take a look at the demographic data with you. Heather, do you want to should we go to that table? I think that's what we were just asked to maybe review.
If there are questions about it, absolutely. So we did provide both performance information by gender, by ethnicity, by primary language, English, or not, and that's also by placement setting, and those were provided in your appendix. And we did see some differences in performance. We also did see differences in performance across the different subject areas, which you've seen. That table was shown in the item as well. Is there a particular one you'd like to look at? Table 4? Sure.
Yeah, the appendix attached to the item, not the PDF at this time.
Yeah, so table 4 in the big appendix that has 100 plus pages of data Sorry, I'll talk louder. Table 4 shows for cycle 1 the demographics. So in this case, we find that we have, out of our 4,000 plus cycle 1 candidates, 73% are female and 27% male. And you can see that the mean performance or median performance is really what we focused on as the standard setting panel discussed around this, a median of 23 for males and 24 for females. Race and ethnicity, you can see here we've got your ethnicity groups, and the range in performance is from 23 median, which represents white, Native American, Hispanic, Southeast Asian, as well as Black, to a 24, which is folks who chose not to respond, Asian, and folks who said they were other categories than what was listed. We looked at setting as a group because candidates tell us whether or not their placement setting is in a city, rural, suburban, town, and we provide definitions around that so that they can, again, this is self-reported, but that they can tell us the nature of their placement. And all of the median scores for those were at 23. And then finally, we ask whether or not the candidates primary language that they spoke growing up in the household was English, or English and one more other language, or one or more languages other than English. So we've provided the breakdown there, and the median scores for all three of those response groups were 23, again on cycle 1.
Shire?
Well, Heather, for my untrained eye, I'm not seeing significant differences among subgroups. Would you agree with that?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I think also we see when we look at the N column, the number, that there are differences in the number of candidates in each of these groups, so they aren't equally represented. Yes, thank you. Table 20 on page 61. So in a similar way, you can see the gender and breakout here, 75% female, 24% male, with the median scores at 25 for male and 26 for female. Race and ethnicity. Our groupings, the median starts at a floor of 25, which represents the Hispanic group, and then and 25.5 at Southeast Asian, up to 26 and 26.5, which represents the other groups. We have captured here the folks that chose not to respond: Black, Asian, white, and other. And again, the settings you can see is a median of 26 across all 4 placement settings. And then finally, the same question about the language spoken in the household growing up, median of 26 across all 3 of those response options.
I just would like to say I very much appreciate Rajal Massara bringing this issue up, and it, in retrospect, we'll put this table in the front material next time we bring this. But I think this is one of the sets of issues. This set of data is the thing we hold our breath waiting to see whether we're having a disparate impact with any examination or assessment that we do. And these data are very encouraging to see how tightly banded the scoring is across all of the different ethnic groups we track and across even the content areas. There's a very tight banding, and even there's a tight banding with the standard deviation largely, which I'm not a statistician either, but if we saw great variation there, that would suggest something else that we'd need to dig into. So I'm encouraged by these data that with a passing recommendation of 19 and 21, the median for all populations is above that. And that speaks to a lack, I think, of bias. I hope that's not an overclaim, but I think we've passed a really important test with this. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Heather, Amy. Yeah.
Redmond?
Thank you, and I definitely appreciate the going over this with us in this way. And I appreciate that this is something that from Director Sandy, her recommendation that this kind of be front and center when we're talking about this. I do want to caution against first of all, I do appreciate, and it's great to see that we're not seeing variation in a big way. However, the percentages of folks who took the exam, it looks like, or at least, and I'm not sure if this is a sampling or those who took it. I'm trying to circle back, but we have an underrepresentation of those who took the exam, and so there could be some selection, self-selection bias, intimidation about even trying to go after this now, right? We have not even enough folks to even have a percentage of Native Americans and Pacific Islanders, but Native Americans specifically are when we're talking about educational equity, it's something that we really need to work on. 2% African American, so it's just something to like to consider as well, or just to keep in mind when we're doing this. So folks could have self-selected into those who knew they could get after. If you look at, the range for white applicants is really wide, right? So everybody's going after it. But with African American, it's actually skewing higher because of that. So there's something potentially there in that too.
May I answer your question too? You asked about the data. This is not a sampling. This is everybody who submitted and was scored on the cycles from last fall. So this is not any field test data. This is the operational data through the end of April. We had to go through the end of April because we brought this same data set to the May meeting with the standard setting panel.
Thank you.
Commissioner Greneau-Shire and then Commissioner Wall.
When I looked at these data, I had a different thought, and that is not that students self-selected, but that we need to continue our recruitment efforts. Because when you look at these percentages, they do match, unfortunately, the percentage of students from different racial and ethnic groups who are coming into teaching. And that's our responsibility to fix that leak in the pipeline, to make sure that all students who want to be teachers get to become teachers, and then we retain them. So that's how I was thinking about this, not so much that certain subgroups of students knew what to do. We're still not where we need to be with recruiting teachers of color.
Commissioner Wall.
So I think it's outstanding work, and one of the things that I would urge us to do, though, as we go forward, is to move beyond measure of central tendency and to actually look at more sophisticated examination of interaction effects, because it may be that we actually are examining all African American women as opposed to African American males, and for instance, things like that. And so there may be interactions that would actually reveal some things that we don't see initially from descriptive. And I wouldn't expect that at this point, but I think as we go forward, we want to be really careful because that could actually be more revealing over time. But it's really great.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and call for a motion. The recommendation is right up here. Would somebody like to make a motion? And it doesn't. Oh, okay.
So I'm going back to your recommendation to skip all level ones, right? Or people who score 1 on the rubric. Is that correct?
So the recommendation. The panel recommended no ones.
Right.
Couldn't,
I'm trying to get a hold of that.
But we are recommending one allowance of 1.
That's what I'm talking about.
Rubric. Yes.
So to the level 1 here says, if I'm reading it correctly, clearly not performing effectively the job of a new teacher. This teacher has demonstrated one or more major problems in teacher knowledge, skills, or abilities that require remediation and may need additional time and opportunity for learning. That's what you're suggesting we accept? I just want to clarify because I'm speaking from a school level And we don't want to see number ones.
Right. So you're reading. Are you reading where with what a 1 is? So another way to think about that is to look where the 1 language is on cycle 1. Where was it? Okay, so 2.3. The score level language for a 1 on 2.3 on your handout on science cycle 2.
So this handout, Commissioner, that's in your folder of score. You have 2 score reports that have been given you as exemplars. Both of them have a score of 1 on 1 rubric.
Right.
So you can see what that. Pardon?
So
on a scale of 1
to 5.
1 to 5. So on if.
Yep. I can.
Those rating levels were used in the panel setting discussion.
Yeah, if I could frame that for you, because we didn't want to jump right in there into 1 through 5, start throwing out score points. The very first thing that we did with our panelists was show them exemplars of performance and ask them to categorize them into one of these 4 buckets. Not using score points, just using a descriptive. And that's where you're clearly below the passing standard descriptive, but we never said that is a 1. The 1 is the rubric language, as Amy was pointing you to, that we wanted to give you an example, and the panelists saw this too, as to, well, I can arrive at a total score of 19, but if I get a 1 as part of that, because there's lots of ways that I could arrive at a score of 19, what does that look like in actual performance? So in this case, for this one particular rubric, I'm looking at the example on mathematics cycle 1, that the candidate's reflection provides no connection between student assets and needs or impact on their planning, teaching, and monitoring of student learning. Or the candidate does not describe an approach to support learning for the whole class and 3 focus students. So that would be the 1 that would be allowed in this scenario. If they had another rubric, though, that had that rubric level description at a 1, that would be outside of the recommendation, and they would not meet the passing standard. Does that help? I'm sorry.
Otherwise, why do you have the 4 rating levels?
We use the 4 rating levels as an exercise with the panelists before we get into rubric levels of 1 through 5 performance. And that 4 rating level describes an entire performance. And so they saw a range of candidate cycle 1 and cycle 2, and they were asked as an individual to categorize it into one of those 4 areas. So when we think about clearly below and clearly above, there's this range. Somewhere within there, we need to establish what the passing score is going to be. We don't know what that is, and everybody's bringing their own background to that discussion. So we give the clearly below the passing standard and a description around that to try to generalize and describe what a performance like that would look like. We aren't saying that that is a 1 because we aren't giving a total score of 1. We're giving a total score of 19, 20, etc.
Right. But you're saying that if a candidate did get a 1, it would be indicative of poor performance, which would go
on that rubric. That's
correct.
Go
back to your rating level.
So can I let me see if I can help. Or do you want to jump in here? Let me step in front of you, Madam Chair.
Commissioner Sloan.
Okay. Yeah. So I think we've got there are 2 different conversations happening with the panel. So when given a set of exemplar candidate performances where they got to see the whole response and the score sheets, et cetera, the question that was asked of them is, which of these 4 buckets would you put it in? Clearly above, clearly below, or maybe just above or just below. So that's a holistic assessment. Read this whole thing, look at the scoring of it, and which of these buckets would you put it in holistically as a way of sorting, as an initial analytic. Because what's really critical in standard setting is figuring out the line between just above and just below. Where do you want to draw that line? So that was the first exercise to get them mentally prepared for looking at candidate performances that are some in each of these buckets, and let's all get clear about which bucket they belong in. Now, set that exercise aside And let's take a look at some candidate performances where you have a score of 1 out of 8 rubrics that shows up. If you look at the sum of all of these comments on, let's just looking at cycle 1 mathematics, rubric 1.1, this person scored a 3, which is a pretty good score for a first timer. 1.2, they got a score of 3. 1.3, a score of 2. So if you look at this composite set of rubric scores for this candidate, they had 1-1. But based on all of this, would you dismiss this person? Would you say no? They had all these strengths, but they had 1-1, and this particular one is about their ability to accurately reflect on what happened. Is that enough reason to fail them on this assessment, or do you push this forward to induction, you give them this feedback, and you allow them to take this issue up in their next range of development? So I think that's how
I think I understand what you're saying is it's in total, I get that, but we spend an awful lot of time at the school level retraining teachers. And we have several years of retraining process that we do with brand new teachers. So I'm just saying, if that one is critical, that's going to be a lot of time we're spending in the classroom retraining. And I'm just wondering whether or not accepting ones isn't opening that Pandora's box, if you will.
Commissioner Sloan?
So I also wanted to speak to this particular piece. So one thing I appreciate, Heather, when you described that in the standard setting process, we're bringing actual candidate work to the table and we're saying, is this indicative of what we want to see in new teachers going into a classroom or not? And how do the scores, pan out? The second thing I want to note is that what Amy had stated, this is a new assessment for everyone, and we are, doing it, for the first couple of times. There are going to be errors that are going to be made that may not be reflective of a candidate's actual abilities and performance. And that's one reason why we have the standard error of measurement that we try to implement. The other part of it is somebody could be having a bad day. We could have a false positive. We could have a false negative. So the idea that we're going to have 2 years to look at what's happening seems important. But the other thing is, I'm hearing you say too, am I comfortable with candidates who score a 1 on any rubric going into a classroom as a new teacher? How do I know? So one thing I have been thinking about is all programs are required to submit biennial reports whereby they choose different types of data that they're going to look at and analyze and tell the commission what they're learning from that data and how they're changing their preparation. So most programs, I think every program, looks at TPA data. And what we can certainly request, I think, over the next couple of years is that programs do an analysis of their data and particularly look at scores of 1 that their candidates receive and see if they can understand why those scores happened. Was it that when they do a deeper sort of deep dive into understanding why you got that 1, is it that the candidates really are not prepared in that area and they need to beef up their preparation of the program? Was it something else? Was it something particular about the setting? That can happen too, the classroom that the teacher is teaching in at that point in time. There's something that made it difficult to do the work. If we can spend the next 2 years gathering information around this, but also ensuring that programs are paying attention to the teachers they are putting in the field, because the TPA is just one indicator that says you're ready to teach. They also have to pass all the program requirements to go out there as well. And one of the important things that we've found in using the TPA is generally it triangulates with the rest of their performance in a program. So when there's something off on the TPA, oftentimes it's additional evidence that a teacher is ready or not ready to teach. And there are other ways that programs then determine whether they're going to go into a classroom or not. So I'm feeling like if I have those assurances over the next couple of years that we're paying attention, then I am probably okay with this. And then I would also sort of like to understand what resubmission options people have, because if we have a relatively strong score report but 1 off rubric, Does that mean candidates need to resubmit the whole thing, or what are those?
Right. So for resubmission, when a candidate gets a score back like this, the first thing we ask is that the program meet with the candidate, and they review the submission itself and the report, and have that very, educative, supportive, coaching conversation about practice. And then, depending on the issue, the candidate can resubmit what was scored at a point that they are comfortable with. And perhaps, like in this case, if under 1.7, it is one narrative that they complete for that. If they look at that narrative together with their faculty person and determine that, yes, I really didn't respond to the prompts, etc., I'm going to redo this narrative, then that's all they would have to do, and they could resubmit. Now, there has to be an understanding that the new submission is scored by a brand new assessor who has no prior knowledge of the first assessment judgment. So, that being said, they might want to really look across everything and tighten things up all together and resubmit. But yes, they have an option of resubmitting everything, or they have an option of resubmitting parts and pieces. And it will be a brand new assessor who scores it. And again, they would receive that back within 3 weeks. We have submissions every single month of the year and sometimes twice a month. So it's not like they're waiting a long time for this. But again, it really depends on the depth of the issue. If it's a planning issue, it could run then through the entire response, if you could imagine, because when they're up on their feet teaching that plan that might have been way off for their focus students, we're not going to see typically that instruction then unfold in a way that we would call it a 3 or, a 2 or a 3. So it really does depend on faculty being available, instructors being available, coaches to those candidates, understanding that submission and having that conversation about what to submit. Is it entirely a resubmission because the practice just isn't there yet and they just need more time to practice? Or is it that they got tired, or they just sort of, I don't know, sometimes we've seen at the end here when they get to the reflective narrative that they just don't even pull from their really quality prior response, and we don't see it, and then they can't get that score that helps them pass. So sometimes that means then they're just redoing a narrative. So it all depends, but all of that is an option.
Commissioner Hartwig and then Commissioner Wall.
Thanks. Could you share with us a little bit of the thinking of the panel? I'm just interested that it was so lopsided in terms of what the panel thought about whether to allow any ones or at all. And obviously that's different than what you're saying. And I'm assuming that the panel had all of these different considerations that we have in mind and that you as staff had in mind with your different recommendation. So I'd be interested to hear what they articulated, because it was 75% to 25% for each of those, and that seems significant to me.
So I'll start, and then Heather and Wayne, you should jump in as well, because we were all there for the 2 days and in the preparation of the materials. But they had a similar response, which was level 1 descriptors. If you had those 17 rubrics in front of you and you read each of those descriptions, and we often said, and they brought up this term, if this was my child in this classroom with this teacher, what would I think about this performance? Would this be okay? Or a child I know, or supported in their development as a learner, and they really debated this a lot. It came up over and over and over again, and so really that my takeaway and my memory of those discussions was that how can we sustain that? How can we say that's okay? So they came to this decision individually, and they went around and shared it with the room. But that was, and then they also had the opportunity to write their response individually, but that wasn't shared. But that was their discussion, was about the way the language describes a level 1 performance. Is that something that we could get through? But when they further dug into the data and looked at particularly single subject responses, they grew a little concerned about how the performance was happening there. And again, we have to go back and remind ourselves that those are smaller N's, and this is 1 year of data, and all of those concerns we have, which is what led us as staff to say, look, let's keep watching this data over the next 2 years. Let's think about the programs that were not in the pre-test or the field test. Let's think about the candidate and what kind of supports they might have received let's remember that they can have peer review and they can talk about their submission with others and get support before they ever submit it, right? All of that was being balanced. But that was my memory, and I don't know, Heather or Wayne, you want to add to that?
I'll just add that these score profiles that you see, the panel had a set of these that ranged a number of total score points, and they did spend quite a bit of time looking at each of these, and it really did come back to the rubric language. So in looking at the rubric language around a score point of 1, that is what resonated with them, is similar to your point about that going into the classroom, that this is an area needing attention. So that really did underlie, I think, a lot of the discussion around ultimately deciding no scores of 1.
Commissioner Wall?
So I'm glad we've come to this. I am so appreciative of the recommendation of staff to have 1 allowed, and I want to give 2 reasons. One is that while I'm super comfortable, and my background is evaluation and statistics, so I'm super comfortable with the holistic measurement. What you actually haven't presented is individual item standard error of measurement, and I bet you have it. So I'm not doubting that you have it, but I recognize that inter-rater dimensions of that can actually have variance. So you end up with, if you have a score of 1 as a threshold, you're no longer looking holistically. You actually have to think about every single item. And that's a new threshold. And so I think as you're beginning an assessment, it's really important to remember that, and you have more data as you go forward. So I think the approach to have, a 2-year period of time, as our chair has articulated, is a really wise period of time to figure that out, because otherwise you're going to get a lot of people who get a 1, and then they go back and they have the whole thing redone again, and then maybe they have a different 1, even though the score is the same. Mm-hmm. And as a person in a programmatic position, I can just hear that conversation going on, right? Oh, now we're in a discussion of the reliability of the instrument, as opposed to the instrument is valid holistically, but right? And I do respect the other side of this, which is, yes, we don't want anyone in the field who has a 1, but I think there's a nice balance, and I think you're doing a great job of striking that balance. I just think it's super important.
Director Sandy?
I'd just like to take a statistics class with Dr. Wall at some point. Commissioners for professional development would be really helpful. So I'm looking at tables 5 and 6 in the front pages of the agenda item, which depict the pass rates at different score levels. So on table 5, these would be the pass rates if you allow the staff recommendation of at most 1 score of 1 in each cycle. And if you maintain the recommended passing standard of 19 on cycle 1 and 21 on cycle 2, you would see an 87% pass rate in the pool of candidates who took this assessment this year. If you allow no 1s, and you look at table 6, that's where that data is, that number drops to 78%. Mm-hmm. And this is a culminating assessment for which candidates have spent a full year in preparation. It's fully embedded in their preparation. They've had opportunity to practice and discuss and engage with all of this. You would hope that you're going to have a high pass rate on an assessment like this that's culminating at the end of preparation. And the thing, so these tables also depict if you apply 1 or either I think a half and then or a full standard error of measure. So if you allow no 1s in either cycle, at those score recommendations, you get a 78% pass rate. In table 6, if you apply a half standard error of measure, 82% pass. If you apply a full standard error of measure, you get 83% passing, but that's reducing your overall scores to 17 and 15, or 15 and 17. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that, with our big standardized assessment systems, examination systems, we typically will apply a standard error of measure, which is a statistical application, because we want to make sure there isn't an error we haven't anticipated. And that's breaking on the side of the candidate in case there's an error in the exam itself. But this is a different type of assessment, and we grappled with this, whether we should apply a statistical error of measure or whether we should apply a more content-based condition for scoring these. And I just wanted to put that on the table, and because allowing 1 score of 1 in the next 2 years and doing the kind of analytic work with our system, all of our preparation programs that are using this to, let's take a look at your scores of 1. How many are you getting? How do those distribute across these different cycles? What does that tell us about your preparation program? Allows us to be just a little formative at the early implementation stages with programs until we're sure everybody's got it. So we're sure that programs are giving candidates every opportunity possible to learn before we really set the stake higher. There's reasonable and good policy reasons for allowing this kind of ramp up to a higher standard. And that's why we pulled these exemplars for you of 2 candidates who got 1 score of 1, so you could see how that plays in the context of a whole performance. And to ask yourselves the question, would I fail this person because their reflection was poor and didn't capture everything it needed to? And if you would, then that tells you where you want to vote and place your vote or recommend a vote. But if you would say, in the context of everything, given this is something everybody's still learning about, this is reasonable, then that's where the staff recommendation comes in. So in short, we're suggesting that an 87% pass rate is a reasonable starting point on this. A 78% pass rate is of some concern, just for a whole variety of other reasons, and that allowing 1 score of 1 would allow a ramp up and building program capacity to prepare candidates to do well on this is a good place to start.
I just had a comment just to sort of reflect on why there was so much discussion on allow score level 1s or not. And a lot of the folks that were on the panel, had a lot of previous Cal TPA experience. And you have to realize that we really sort of turned the pyramid upside down. The old Cal TPA was students' own unaided work. And we just flipped that around and said, that really doesn't make any sense, 10 years down the road. Everybody that is involved in the teacher preparation program, the master teachers, the student supervisors, the faculty, adjunct faculty, they all need to be on board and all part of the same conversation, giving the same messaging to candidates and helping them up front to make good decisions so they can be successful on the Cal TPA. So Amy and I get lots of emails throughout this whole development time from individual programs and from faculty going, what did you mean by this, and how do we do this, and how can I do better to prepare my candidates in my classes? And one of the things that was reiterated earlier too is that if candidates go back and they look at this as they should look at this data for program improvement, and they're seeing that in this one particular area our candidates are getting low scores, then we need to do something in our program to gear it up. So I think by allowing this score level 1, it's not putting that concept of fatal flaw in here, but it's allowing programs to continue to learn and continue to gear up, knowing that they need to be an integral part of this whole support process and making sure before candidates hit that submit button that they're on the right page. So by allowing that piece of time in there, I think we're making the right decision to go that way.
Any other comments, questions? All right. So there was a motion that was recommended by staff, right? If we could get that up there again, is it possible?
Yep, absolutely. It's on our screen. It's on your agenda item, and it's in your agenda item.
Yes.
Right. So page 14.
It's on page 4.
On page.
Actually, 3.
14. What page number?
Page 14.
Yeah, in mine is not the right one. At the very end of your item, the recommendation.
Yep, page 14.
Score of 19, score of 21.
2D 14.
Okay.
Or on the screen.
There we go. I was in the PDF and it was like, okay.
Just to repeat, the recommendation by staff is that for cycle 1, which includes 8 rubrics, there's a final cut score of 19 points with 1 score of 1 allowed. Cycle 2 is a final cut score of 21 points with 1 score of 1 allowed. and no SEM applied, and we would continue to gather data for 2 years and come back to you.
Okay. Would somebody like to make a motion? Okay. Do we have a second? Motion made by Commissioner Gonzalez, seconded by Commissioner Klatt. So I'll call for a vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, motion carries. Thank you. Thank you so much for all of your work on this. So do I hear a motion to break for lunch? Well, that was my stomach. Okay, made a motion, seconded. We'll be back here at 1:15. Thank you. So we've moved on to item 2E, and our presenters are ready. Item 2E is a proposal to streamline the single subject matter program standards and review process. The item is being presented by Miranda Gutierrez and Hart Boyd. This is an information action item, so Mr. Boyd, will you please begin?
Yes, thank you. This agenda item shares a proposal to streamline the program standards and review process for prospective single subject matter programs. In keeping with the accreditation system's streamlining efforts of the past few years, staff identified areas for potential improvement regarding the SSM program review and approval process, which could be streamlined to align more consistently with the more recently adopted elementary subject matter program standards and review process. For the sake of clarity, it should be noted that what is being proposed in this item is separate from the proposal presented to the Commission in February regarding the option to mix and match coursework with CSET examinations to satisfy the subject matter requirement. In 2010, a subject matter advisory panel was convened to review the 10 program standards common to all SSM programs. Staff brought a recommendation from the advisory panel to the Commission that reduced the standards common to all SSM programs from 10 to 2 standards in order to streamline the process for review and approval. At the August 2010 meeting, the Commission adopted these 2 standards common to all, and responses to them became a submission requirement. But in addition to responding to the 2 standards common to all, prospective SSM programs must also provide responses to the specific program standards for each content area. The majority of these program standards align closely to the subject matter requirements for each specific single subject content area, which causes a prospective SSM program to provide duplicative work in their submissions, in that they are submitting a matrix that shows where each SMR is addressed in coursework and are also required to provide a narrative response addressing the content area. Furthermore, there are some SSM content areas such as agriculture, art, home economics, and science that have additional program standards that incorporate fieldwork and other teacher preparation concepts into the subject matter program. This highlights a disparity between these SSM program standards and the process for ESM programs. Education Code notes that the standards for program quality and effectiveness governing subject matter programs that waive the subject matter examination must be consistent with the assessments and examinations of subject matter knowledge and competence adopted by the Commission. The Commission has implemented this requirement for consistency by requiring credential candidates who choose to pass a subject matter exam and candidates who choose to complete a Commission-approved subject matter program to demonstrate subject matter competence across the same set of subject matter requirements as applicable to each credential content area. When looking at consistency between subject matter examinations in programs, it becomes evident that subject matter should be assessed independent of any pedagogy for the content area and should be determined solely based on an objective knowledge of the subject matter. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Miranda to review the current SSM submission requirements and process in relation to the more recently adopted ESM process.
So the requirements for submission vary somewhat by program. On Table 2 of the item, you can see an outline of the requirements for the ESM programs on the left, and then on the right, the single subject matter programs. For ESM programs, there are 4 requirements in the submission. Those are the preconditions, a course scope and sequence, program standards, and an alignment matrix. The single subject matter programs require preconditions, standards common to all, content-specific program standards, and an alignment matrix. As Hart mentioned, there are content-specific programs that align with the subject matter requirements, which causes duplicative work to be submitted and reviewed. He also mentioned there are some program standards in content areas that require or incorporate fieldwork and teaching preparation concepts, such as teaching and learning and assessment strategies. So the content-specific standards can be found in Appendix C, and if you're following along, we're going to look at a couple of those. As you look at Appendix C and click on the hyperlink for English, you'll see a column for the subject matter requirements on the left and the content-specific program standards on the right. You'll notice that the program standards begin with Standard 3, because as we mentioned before, there are those two standards common to all, and those are always 1 and 2 in the standards. So you can see that looks beginning with Standard 5 in English, the content-specific standard heading aligns with the subject matter requirement. As you continue to look through, you'll see that commonality through the English content area. If you scroll down to page 36, which is social science, you'll notice that beginning with Program Standard 6, the standards cover the content of the subject matter requirements, that all the subject matter requirements are included somewhere within those content standards. They don't align as evenly as they did with English, but they're all included in there. And as you scroll down the rest of those social science standards, you can see in standards 10 and 11 that they incorporate ethics and teaching and learning practices. And these standards actually fall outside of the subject matter requirements, which means that candidates who choose the exam route are not assessed on these concepts. As you look through Appendix C, you'll also see other content areas where the program standards align pretty evenly with the subject matter requirements, for example, world languages, music, and business. We've also included the content areas and the program standards that do not align with the subject matter requirements so that you can see the excess standards that are in the program. So this reveals an inequity between expectations between the different SSM programs, and it goes above and beyond what is expressed in the ed code that Hart mentioned. It also highlights that the program submission requirements are redundant and excessive when compared to what is required for ESM programs. And in continuing with the streamlining work that has taken place over the last few years, and to create parity amongst all subject matter programs with the focus on the subject matter requirements, staff recommends that the Commission discuss and take action to approve the streamline process for single subject matter program approval. Additionally, staff recommends that the standards common to all be retitled to SSM program standards. That concludes our presentation. We're happy to answer questions.
We don't have any public comment for this item. Do we have any questions, clarification questions from the commissioners? Okay, so this is an information action item, and we will, does anybody have a motion to approve the streamlining for the process for the subject, single subject? Okay, do we have a second? All right, thank you. So we have a motion by Commissioner Alavy and a second by Commissioner Sloan. Any further discussion? No?
Just an appreciation for bringing this forward because, as you know, the subject matter program process for establishing new programs has become pretty onerous for programs. And so any ways that we can work to both ensure that the programs are of high quality but not make too many hoops to jump through are important. And I think this is a conversation that we'll have in future too. What really do we need to ensure that candidates are subject matter competent? But this is a good first step. Thank you.
Okay, so our final item is item 2F, proposed definitions for pathways to preliminary teaching credential for use in the accreditation data system. This item is being presented by Cara Mendoza and Cheryl Hickey. This is an information action item. Ms. Hickey, will you please begin? when you're ready.
Great. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So agenda item 2F presents the proposed definitions for different types of teacher preparation pathways for use with the annual accreditation data system. So as you are aware, the development and implementation of a new annual accreditation data system was really one of the hallmarks of the strengthening and streamlining accreditation project that we undertook beginning in 2014. And we constructed the system in 2016-17 using an external contractor. So it's through this system that the Commission has begun collecting important statewide information about the vast array of educator preparation programs in the state that we previously didn't have access to in any single manner or in an efficient manner. With over 250 Commission-approved institutions offering over approximately 1,000 different credential programs, this data system is really critical if the state is to have some essential information that helps us understand not only the numbers and types of programs, which is information we already did have, but really the critical aspects of these programs and how they are delivered in California. So beginning last summer, the Commission-approved institutions began reporting on various aspects. This included, just for example, more timely enrollment information, program admissions requirements, types of pathways, number of hours of clinical practice, whether the program is offered for undergraduates or post-secondary, whether the program is online, face-to-face, hybrid, and a variety of other types of information. The information that's submitted by the institutions is self-reported, and it's intended for use by the Commission to better understand the programs, to respond to questions that are often asked to us, from policymakers, from the public, and to be able to really just have more accurate and timely information. And soon we hope to be able to have enough information there to be able to use for accreditation site visit teams once we get some more useful information and try to figure out how teams would have access to this. So the system is really new. It has been operational for only 1 year, and thus we have very limited data at this point. We do plan to bring to the Commission a more comprehensive item about the data that's been collected so far and what we're seeing. We would like to thank all the Commission-approved institutions for their cooperation, assistance, and patience during this first year. It was a learning process for all of us. They've really been wonderful partners to work with and have given us a lot of good feedback, and together we've kind of built this system from the ground up. So, being a new system, we're learning along the way, and we anticipate that we'll need to consider tweaks and improvements and continue the development work over the next few years. For instance, as Amy mentioned in her earlier item, we hope to have the information from the TPA in the data system so that we can have some useful information and have real efficiency. For successful implementation of a statewide data system that will capture information about such a large and diverse state, and in order to ensure that the data that we were able to get out of the system is as clean and as accurate as possible, it requires that we as a state take a small but important step in trying to develop some common language that will be used by all institutions as a guide to self-report the data for the Commission system. It's important to note that the definitions in this item that Dr. Mendoza will discuss in a minute are meant only for the purposes of the annual accreditation data system. There is no plan to adopt separate standards or a different accreditation process for each of the proposed pathways. All of these pathways must still meet the same Commission-adopted standards. So rather, the purpose is simply to ensure that when institutions report their offerings, although there may be some differences between the institutions on various aspects within those pathways, we're really generally talking apples to apples. So that's what we're trying to do at this point in time. We all have experiences with data systems that have limited usefulness because of the variances in how the data is reported, and it's our hope that as we build this system from the ground up, we build a system in which we can be really confident in the data that's being produced. So I want to turn this over to Dr. Mendoza.
Thank you, Cheryl. Good afternoon, Commissioners.
Good afternoon.
On page 2 of the agenda item, you will see the proposed teacher preparation program pathway definitions for use with the accreditation system. The definitions on the table are to be considered guiding definitions. As we know, teacher preparation program pathways are designed by institutions And the information you see in the table is staff's efforts to assign language to the myriad of teacher preparation pathways. We intend for the definitions to capture a foundation of essential components for each pathway. We know that many institutions, if not all, layer additional features beyond the definitions we propose here. The definitions are not an end-all or a be-all. Instead, we hope they serve as guidance for institutions to self-report their teacher preparation program pathways. 4 of the 5 pathways proposed in the definitions in this item fall under student teaching. They are traditional student teaching, teacher residency, co-teaching, and private schools. The 5th pathway, intern, is not considered a student teaching pathway. With this said, we have a correction to the table. Please see the last sentence under intern. In an effort to confirm that all of the student teaching pathways require a minimum of 600 hours of student teaching, we also inadvertently cut and pasted that added sentence under intern. We apologize. An intern pathway, we all know, is not a student teaching pathway. However, intern programs are subject to the same minimum required number of hours as all other pathways. The last sentence should read 600 hours of supervised clinical practice. Again, the definitions included in the table are for guidance only in the ADS. The institutions design teacher preparation program pathways in concert with their local context. We hope the definitions provided support institutions as they navigate this new system. With this, I invite Cheryl to conclude our presentation.
So these proposed definitions can be revisited in future years also. They're not set in stone. We believe that most teacher preparation programs can fall into one of these categories, but as we work with institutions, if there is another pathway we haven't thought about or that's commonly used, we're certainly willing to have those conversations with institutions. We're quite open. So we're happy to answer any questions or take any suggested edits that you would like.
Okay, we do have a public comment card. Jane Robb, would you please come up?
Good morning, or good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Jane Robb, California Teachers Association. Thank you. I really appreciate this item and the intention to have everybody speaking the same language. It makes life so much easier. A couple of comments, and I was going to point out the intern discrepancy. But in further reflection, I actually went back and looked at Program Standard 3, and I looked at your guidance document. And the language you use in all of them is not 600 hours of student teaching. It is clinical practice. And that would solve all of the problems of differentiating. And it would also be consistent with the separate guidance document that you developed 2 years ago about what that 600 hours consists of. So it might be a good idea to just make all the documents align with one another. So that's the first. The second question, comment, is the co-teaching description. And this came to me, you should never let me sit through your meetings, when Mary was talking about simplifying. It seems as if co-teaching is a subset model of either a teacher residency or a traditional student teaching program. I don't see how it's a different pathway. As you explained, there are lots of different models that fit underneath it. I'm not sure it's actually a separate pathway, but rather a subset of a model within the other pathways. So that would be something else to think about. And then the third thing I wanted to mention is we continue to have concerns about the private school teaching option. And again, which I know you guys all know front back, your guidance from 2 years ago on what the 600 hours consists of and what private school teaching, how that fits into the system. And right now you have a requirement of a minimum of 600 hours of clinical practice supervised, and very robust descriptions of what that looks like and what that can consist of. And only 150 hours have to be if you are using the private school option, only 1/4 of those hours, 150 hours, have to even be in a school that uses California curriculum. I feel like that's a really disservice when we're trying to make teachers well prepared to serve students, that we don't differentiate among private schools. We have, you guys all know this, we all have California certified, California funded non-public schools, non-sectarian non-public schools that provide very specific programs for students with special needs that can't be served in the public schools, in their traditional public school. So those are those kinds of public schools. They have to do child abuse reporting. They have to be fingerprinted. They have to have staff that's credentialed. They have to meet California standards, all of those things. We have all kinds of private schools, from mom and pop, hang up a shingle private schools who meet none of those things, to very robust, quality private schools. And we make no distinction of where we place teachers between that huge body of private schools. I find that very concerning, because we are supposed to be preparing teachers to teach in California public schools as our highest priority. And just having a quarter of their 600 hours in any school that has a diverse student body population and teaches standards that are aligned with California, not even California standards, I think is a real disservice. We have private and public school higher ed commissioners on this commission. We work as a commission, and as a state, we work with public and private higher education institutions, but we don't work as commissioners. You don't work with all of them. You work with ones that are accredited. You work with ones that meet certain standards. Not everybody gets to play in the teacher preparation game. And I think that same bar should be held for the full set of private schools that exist in California. So I urge you to reconsider that in all of this policy making. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. All right. Commissioners, any comments or questions? Yes, Commissioner Francois.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the thoughtfulness behind this analysis, and I agree with everything that was just said. And I would also like to add, building on what our CABE colleague said earlier, that language matters. And so one of the other pieces that I'm having a little bit of difficulty is when we say traditional student teaching. In the field, the word traditional has been taken up to mean non-innovative, university-based primarily teacher education programs, and has been used by reform-minded folks to undermine university-based teacher education programs, particularly those that are working in marginalized communities. And so if we're going to relook at the language of this, I would recommend thinking carefully about whether or not to use the word traditional. And I agree that this is all about clinical experience and clinical practice.
About clinical practice, we could easily make that change. In fact, I almost did before this item got reprinted. Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments? Yes, Commissioner Martinez.
Hi. No, I appreciate the comments also, and support the fact that I wouldn't see co-teaching as its own pathway, but that it's part of teacher residency and student teaching. And then if you're going to change language to clinical practice, I wonder if maybe you define what that means, just like in parentheses or something, because you do use a lot of clinical experience. So in terms of differentiating that, and then I wonder just about the question around private schools. If it could just be around, if the issue could be solved by saying accredited, private schools that are accredited. I mean, that's a larger policy issue, but accreditation is really important, and a lot of independent schools do get accredited by WASC or somebody else. I think that's it.
The Commissioner Greneau-Shire, and then I think Cheryl will respond to that.
I appreciate the comments, and I agree that co-teaching is a subset, so we could make sure that it gets included in teacher residency or student teaching I agree with Commissioner Francois that traditional label raises some eyebrows in some circles, so I would get rid of that. Thank you.
Commissioner Sloan?
Thank you for this item. I think it's important that we get some of these new kinds of pathways identified in our data system. And I think it's going to take some time to figure out how we identify those pathways, because as we all know, there are sometimes as much variation within a pathway as there is between them at times. And so I appreciate that we're going to have, that we could use a year of trying this new reporting system and teasing out the kinds of questions that programs have when they don't know, am I this or am I that? And then I think the other thing to bear in mind is, what is our purpose behind distinguishing these? What is it that we want to know? And so I know that we'll probably need some clarification for the field on some of the terms, and I know we've talked a bit about these, so I'll just say, so on the table, particularly if we just are looking first at how we define residencies. In the field, residencies are defined in a lot of ways, and I appreciate that for our purposes, we're not defining them in terms of you have to be hired afterwards, there's money exchange, all of those kinds of things, but we're just really looking at the preparation experience itself. And one of the words being used in the table under teacher residency is that it is implemented through an intense collaborative partnership between an LEA and an institution of higher education. That's a key component to a residency. So intense needs some defining. And one of the things I have seen in the field around intense is that the LEA and the IHE are really co-developers and co-planners of the experience and the program. And that there is, the other things I have heard staff saying as we've had conversations is that everybody has some ownership in how the program works in the schools. It's not just the IHE who is responsible for preparing teachers. It is the site supervised or site supervision faculty who are also have ownership. The other thing I've heard put in there is everybody is concerned with continuous learning, both people who are employed at the district and people who are employed in higher ed. So some of those things could probably go into defining what intense means, partnerships, intense partnerships. The other question I had was around the additional support for the cooperating teachers who are working with the residents. That I think will also need to get understood a little bit better, and it would be good to understand from people who are running residencies as well as people who think they're running student teaching programs to learn a little bit more about the kinds of supports that cooperating teachers get. One of the things I think we're struggling with as a field even is our policy around we need 10 hours of support or training for new cooperating teachers. And we're still learning whether that's the right metric. And so this can help us, I think, understand a little bit more about both of those areas. My other question I have, and I know staff have also been fielding a lot of questions around defining clinical practice in terms of number of hours as, again, the right metric. And I think it's something we should look at in future, and I know staff is also interested in looking at that in future. But if we define student teaching as requiring 600 hours of field work, clinical practice, and we're defining residencies as requiring at least 50% time in placement, if a school day is 180 days, and if teaching hours is 8 hours? 6 or 7? Well, then if we did the math, so I did it with 8. So I did 180 days by 4 hours, came out to 720 hours, which isn't that much more than the 600 hours. What does 3 hours and 180 days come out to be? 500 and something, yeah. approximately. So, and I know that the 600 hours of student teaching, as the way it's defined, can include a variety of activities. Mm-hmm. But still, we think of residencies as being super immersed in the school sites in a different way than sometimes student teaching programs can. And these other programs exist for a number of reasons. Sometimes teacher candidates need more flexibility in their day. They need more time. That they need to they have other things that they're doing to support themselves in life, et cetera, et cetera. So we need probably both types, but I'm not really sure how we will end up distinguishing between the two. And I think this is what this year will help us with. And I only have two more things to say. The other thing that I noticed in the item that's important is that, and currently, programs identify the percentage of time that whatever preparation pathway we're engaged in is involving online instruction versus face-to-face instruction. What we don't currently identify is whether that's asynchronous or synchronous. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important thing to understand. It's a very different type of learning. The other thing we don't currently collect that could be important is whether the online instruction is for coursework or whether it's for supervision of clinical practice. I think those are also two very different kinds of activities, and it might be very important for us to know what's happening with our preparation programs in that regard.
Right. Currently, right now, we don't collect that data, but we are in the process of, I don't know what the word is, supplementing or augmenting the system itself this year right now. Mm-hmm. And we could build that in right now. So we could start doing that. The reporting year wouldn't be for the following year, but we certainly could build that in right now. So I think that would be a good idea.
Well, that would be, we can see what other commissioners think, but it just seems like if we have an opportunity to do that and it's not that difficult, I know it's more reporting on the part of programs. I don't know how hard it would be, but again, for this 1 year, if we can, this is my final point, this 1 year sort of trial and learning process, if we could figure out how we can learn how the difficulties programs are having, how we can, build our system better based on what we're hearing from the field. And I'm not sure what that exact process would be, but that would be helpful too. So that's it. Those are my comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Sloan. Any other comments? No? Yes, Commissioner Klatt.
As long as we're talking about defining terms, I didn't think I was going to make this comment, but I feel compelled. We use the term master teacher a lot in different ways, and I think as Chair Sloan just pointed out, the idea about the 10 hours and what's appropriate to make someone a master teacher. And although I know this is this maybe in my lifetime this will happen, but I still have this dream that someday we'll be able to somehow give authorizations around the idea of, because we have induction, we have student teaching, we have teachers who are employed as teachers on special assignment in districts. We have all these situations where teachers are employed in some manner as coaches, and yet we don't have any consistent way as a teacher, to say I have this experience and I'm qualified to do this and that it's portable. And if we had some kind of authorization, then definitions like this where we say master teacher might mean something different or specific. So I know it's a dream, but someday maybe.
All right. Cheryl?
Just to respond to the private school issue and why it's on this chart. We have institutions that have candidates who know that they want to teach in a private school, but they want the credential. Sometimes they're mixed in with all of the other credential candidates, and sometimes it's a specific thread or a cohort of candidates. And it's helpful for us in accreditation to know how an institution looks at at those candidates. We want to be clear who is going for a California credential, regardless of where they think that they're going to teach next year, so that we have that. And so that's why this is on here, is just to get a better sense of those institutions that have a specific pathway for private school folks that are actually going to get a credential. So it's helpful for us from an accreditation standpoint to understand the institution. If you wanted to talk about the other issues that Ms. Robb did, that we could bring, that could come back at another, that's a discussion about the standards themselves.
I was just going to mention that I think that would be a good thing. I know this is not an item where we can change policy. We're just talking about that. But I think the points that Jane Robb brought up are important ones for us to look at. I don't know if that, I know coming up in August we have an agenda item on accreditation. I don't know if that would be a part of that. No, it's not. Oh, I know at our next meeting there's an agenda item on accreditation updates. Is this possibly could be a part of that discussion?
That as long as we notice it, we certainly could.
And
if that's the will of the group, sure.
Maybe an exploration of some of these terms that people have mentioned.
So I just want to understand this right. So I'm just imagining a program reporting on these different definitions, and many programs reporting on more than one. So they're going to disaggregate their data, and that's the intention, right?
Intent is to understand how many pathways or what types of pathways they have for the same credential. There are many institutions that have different strands of candidates, and sometimes the programs are very similar, and sometimes the course and sequencing of the coursework is very different.
So does that mean they will disaggregate, though, for this by strand?
Oh,
That's
I'm
what
sorry.
I'm trying to get clear.
They won't double count. Yes,
Okay,
they will
that's what I
disaggregate. I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so this is an information action item, and do I have a motion that the Commission approve the proposed definitions with the changes that were suggested for teacher preparation program pathways for use in the ADS, Accreditation Data Systems? Okay, do I have a second? All right, so motion made by Commissioner Sloan, seconded by Commissioner Martinez and Jackson. Commissioner Martinez, did you? Yes, we do have a motion and a second, so you can.
So I don't understand it. Does two things. Does the motion include issues around the description traditional, or we're just leaving it the way it is for now? That's question one. And question two is, as I read it with the Commission standards requiring a minimum of 600 hours of supervised clinical practice in all 5 of these, I now don't quite understand the difference between why internship, since it is supervised clinical practice, doesn't, quote, count as student teaching. So I'm getting confused now.
It's because they're the teacher of record, and it's just they're still doing student teaching like things, but they are interns. They're the teacher of record. So if we were to substitute, as Ms. Robb suggested, 600 hours of clinical practice all the way through, we're just fine. It's fine in its context.
So even though the intern serves as the teacher of record and also gets extensive support and supervision by the prep program and the employer, it still doesn't count as. I'm just confused.
It's a terminology issue. We don't refer to interns necessarily as student teachers because they are the teacher of record. They're interns. It's just a more precise term. I don't know, Terry. Terry was hoping not to come to the table this meeting, but she is.
Commissioner Brown, for a candidate to be a student teacher, they are in a master teacher's classroom. So they're in a credentialed teacher's classroom who is helping train them. An intern never has a master teacher because they are the teacher of record. So that's why intern still needs to have a separate category in and of itself. And you'll notice on some of the data reports, like when LPI reports on things, they're always talking about credential teachers and people on interns, permits, and waivers because they have not yet earned a preliminary credential.
And so I'm beginning to understand that distinction. I don't understand if that same situation could be happening in private schools, because this just says student teaching experience / clinical practice.
Actually, private schools are not eligible to have interns because the enabling legislation for the internship says you must be in a local education agency, in a public school. So we actually, as an agency, are not supposed to give internship credentials to people who are in private schools. And that is another distinction. Some of those private school teachers are actually teaching. They don't have a master teacher. And
I know.
Some of our, especially our private institutions, have developed entire cohorts and programs that are very specialized. And so we're trying to get a better understanding of what's going on out there, including enrollment. Remember, we've never had enrollment data. And so through this system is the first time we're getting actually enrollment data. So to understand which pathway they're in and how many people are in each pathway is actually so exciting.
Yeah. Okay. And the issue around the titling of the first pathway, are we leaving it the way it is for now?
We can easily remove the word traditional. It can just say student teaching. This isn't something you're adopting like standards where every word has to be exact.
Okay.
You're giving us guidance so that Ms. Hickey can finalize this and we can get it up on the webpage.
Right. We've been doing that all morning, so I kind of got into
that. Is true.
You know,
you got in that round.
Okay.
Commissioner Francois?
Thank you. I think the challenging part for us, and I think therefore for the public, will be this first column that we've named student teaching, and yet when we talk about all of these pathways, we've been using the word clinical experience. So my follow-up question would be, why is there not a single column that stretches the entirety of this chart that says clinical experience, clinical practice, which would include the intern program, removing the traditional, and if we really wanted to be aspirational, get rid of student teaching altogether and use something more akin to co-teaching, because that's really what we want teachers and student teachers to do. And going back to language, because student teacher has such a historical definition, and it's really about, I'll give you part of this day to teach in my class, and that's it, that we might want to think about, let's just get rid of traditional student teaching and elevate our expectations and articulate it through more of a co-teaching model. I know that that's long-term. That's why I said aspirational, Terry. Yeah. I understand what has to be done in the moment, though.
The reason co-teaching is on there has been my push. I've been asked by both my staff and my executive director, why is this on here as separate? And I've been to a number of presentations and I've read about the St. Cloud model where from day one, the students and the teachers don't even know, the students and the parents don't know who's the student teacher and who's the credentialed teacher. It is such a collaborative approach, and it would be great if we could get there. But by removing student teaching from the data system isn't going to move us there. It's just going to mask the situation. But I think if we can get some pretty clear definitions, we can then maybe work with some of the programs that are more innovative, understand what they're doing, and help spread the knowledge. So that's why I think we do need to keep student teaching, but clearly we can take the word traditional off.
Director Sandy, and then
you may
Commissioner
be
Sloan.
changing the subject, so let me just jump in on this last point. I love this conversation. Because I'm compelled by hearing the different reflections on each of the rows in this table, that each one of them is differentiated. Test this idea. Each one of these is differentiated by the type and structure of clinical practice. So these are all forms of clinical practice with more or less supervision or mentoring or co-teaching or independent practice with somebody occasionally visiting your classroom, et cetera. So it does seem to me that these are all not student teaching, but clinical practice, and these are the different forms it takes for us. And I love pushing that idea forward if that's where we are.
Commissioner Sloan?
I love that idea as well, and I'm still having a hard time distinguishing then between the residencies and the what we currently call traditional teaching models. And if we're looking at percentage of time, and whether or not our understanding is that residencies mean you're in a school setting longer each day maybe than others might be. And if that is the case, I'm going to open it up to ask, commissioners, would we want then to have more time defined as residencies? So 50% time we said right now, if we were just doing hours, was 540 hours, even less than what we're saying potentially might be the case, unless we clarify that and say there's other things. But if we went to 65% time instead, that'd be 702 hours. 75% would be 810 hours. 80%, which would be 4 days a week, say, that's going to be 864 hours. Do we want to raise the percentage is my question I'd like to put out there.
Thank you. So we have a challenge with raising the standards at this point because the teacher residency grants were identified as 50%, the whole year at 50% time.
Commissioner Greneau-Shire?
I wanted to add that I think in my mind, what differentiates residencies is beyond just the amount of time. And I think there are important lessons to be learned from the New Generation of Educators initiative that we have engaged in the CSU over the last 5 or 6 years now, about the co-construction of this experience, from what the teacher does on day one to how the master teachers are selected, how the supervisors are selected or trained, how there is co-construction of tools and processes in these residency programs. So I would offer to share some of those lessons learned from this project to help inform this conversation. I'll make sure that Mary gets that and Tina gets that.
So then if we're going to, I think this is a very important thing for us to do, to define residencies in that way in terms of the characteristics and the nature of the clinical practice, and likewise we should look at that for all pathways. And if so, it might behoove us, anybody who is currently designing and running clinical practice, to really think about what those characteristics should be that we should be considering here for each of those. Come back.
So now that I see that we have the same line for all 5, is it really, have we moved to trying to define supervised clinical practice? And how is that distinguished from pathways? Now I'm trying to stay clear, but
You're right. All of them do require a minimum of 600 hours of supervised clinical practice. I would summarize that the distinctions are that the first one, the student teaching, that's the one where it's somewhat more likely the principal may point at you and say, you're getting a student teacher tomorrow. There was no pre-planning. That's more at the top row. The second row, you'll see there's terminology in there about an intense partnership. And I think we even have had Chair Sloan talk about where the LEA and the IHE co-develop the structure. I think we could add that in there. The co-teaching one, we might even want to be more overt here to say that from day one, they are equal partners, and actually students and families don't know who is who. That's what the research that I've read about co-teaching is. The private school one, I don't know that we would fiddle with that a lot, but then the intern one, it's where the candidate is the teacher of record. Yes, they have a mentor on site. They have a supervisor. So even though they each have 600 hours, there are unique attributes to how that 600 hours of supervised clinical practice rolls out. That's what we're trying to get at in here, I think.
That's why I like having Terry on our team, because the distinction, it may not be perfect, we may not be finished, but now I can begin to see that there are distinctions, because I can imagine programs looking and saying, I got a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So if it could, your distinguishing of that is certainly helpful to me.
And we actually have weekly office hours on Zoom where any institution can just log on, talk with either Cheryl or myself, or we have a staff member who does this on a weekly basis, normally a couple hours a week. And she answers questions just like this. So they come on and say, what do you think about this? Should we put that? And so it's not that they're out doing it in a vacuum. There's a good amount of support as they prepare to do this.
Commissioner Sloan?
So if we're going to add terms to, so you mentioned, so the intents means that it's co-developed. I think that there is something very different too about ongoing ownership and responsibility for the preparation, because I think there were a lot of our programs that were co-developed at one time between LEAs and IHEs, and then the co-ownership over time isn't maybe necessarily there. I feel like that's an important distinction for residencies.
Okay, so we do have a motion and a second. We'll go ahead and with the feedback that you've been given, right, this isn't going to be the definitive end all. It'll come back to us, I'm sure, before it goes up on the website. Yes?
Actually, it would probably come back to you later this fall. The data is really due from institutions by August 15th, which is why we rushed to get it on this agenda. So we can actually next week get information out to programs on this.
Okay.
Their data is due August 15th. So either the late September or the November meeting, we would actually be able to bring you some data of this is what they told us, and this is now how we could refine it. So it won't be next meeting, but.
Okay. So all those in favor, please say aye. Anyone opposed? Okay, motion carries. Thank you. Having no additional items, I adjourn the Educator Preparation Committee.
Commissioners, we have a clarification. Can I have a motion to reopen the consent calendar? So moved by Commissioner Klatt, seconded by Commissioner Jackson. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yes, Madam Chair and Commissioners, it was my intent to recuse on item 49, Avila, not Pool. So I appreciate you opening that back up. So for the record, that would be a recusal on consent item 49, Avila.
Okay. So this is not then, I'm sorry? It was pulled off consent, and now we're going to put it back on consent because it was not meant to be pulled off consent. It was simply a recusal. So can I have a motion that would adopt the committee's recommendation on number 49, Avila? So moved. Second? Second. So moved by Commissioner Rodriguez, seconded by Commissioner Alavi. All those in favor say aye. All opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. All right. I will now recess the general session. Members of the commission will go into closed session. The general session will reconvene at 8:30 tomorrow morning. Thank you.